to our OCS tutorial series. My name is Ari. Thank you for returning. Today we're going to be covering a great deal of topics, but before we get into that, I wanted to just start by talking about how far we've come, where we're at, and where we're going with this tutorial series, because we've covered a lot up to this point. Certainly haven't covered everything. I hope I've been able to allow these concepts to make sense in the ways that I've chosen to explain them. If you feel like there's any particular concept that has been covered thus far that you feel like didn't receive enough attention, feel free to leave me a comment. Happy to make little snapshot videos where I can take a concept and give it a little bit more attention, a few more examples of play, a few more examples of how it functions, a few more readings, whatever anybody needs. Happy to do that. Now, we are about halfway through the manual, practically speaking. Obviously, in video number 0, we covered some preliminary things about how to set up your vassal and such, or your board for that matter. And in video 1, we covered the basics of what the units are, and video 1 we covered map reading, my bad, and we covered how to navigate the basics of the map, and some preliminary things. And then in video 2 we took a look at what units are, and various different types of units that you'll run into over the course of your play. Video number 3 we looked at how to move units, especially ground units, in all the various different ways that you can move them, which is critical. It's going to be some of the first things you're doing as you start to play the game, is moving units around via various modes of transport. And in video number 4 we looked at supply and zone of control and all of those finicky little details that are going to govern what's possible as you move your units around the map. Who's going to starve, who's going to get fed, and how you pay for all the various actions that you want to undertake. So up until that point, that covers us about halfway. I'll show you my little document here to give you a better idea. This is my little document for covering what I have covered and what I haven't. And I'm going to be, at the end of the series, I will have a table of contents video that people can come to, and they can see, right, well, what specific concept am I looking for, and what video is it covered in? So I have highlighted in yellow here the parts of the game that we haven't covered yet. So as you can see, I've got the name of the video where if something is already covered, that's where it's covered, but we haven't looked at reaction, combat, exploitation, or cleanup yet. We haven't covered anything related to the various types of aircraft units. There's a few fundamental game details here that have come up in some videos, but in this video in particular, as we look into combat, I will give a little bit more focus to these fundamental concepts known as the rounding rule, fractions, and cumulative effects, because I think they're best observed when conducting combat. Stacking and Fog of War really deserve their own video, especially Fog of War, as they contain intricacies that you really only want to be getting into in your right after you've learned everything else, basically speaking. DG, exploitation, overrun, reaction, ground combat, and artillery barrages are what compromises what I'm going to be covering in today's video. When I say barrages, I'm not including air barrages. That's going to be included in the larger video about air operations, which will be the next big video after this one. And after that, there is still a number of smaller things to cover. We need to get a little bit more in detail when it comes to replacements, reinforcements, formation markers, engineer functions, consolidations, little smaller parts of the manual that are still important, and they do need to be covered. And obviously there's all these elements of air power that have really yet to be touched on. Air power, air bases. We haven't really talked much about hedgehogs, although I believe that's really something that we can come up with in this video, because really hedgehogs, one of their primary use is in the context of combat. So if not now, I'm not sure when I was really going to cover it. Whether we'll have a more in-depth discussion about that at a later time, but it's really something that I think we want to talk about a lot more when we do specific videos about specific games, whether it be Smolensk, Tunisia, Korea, or whatever it may be. Naval ports and shippings, that really deserves its own video as well. Breakdowns, yeah, that's another one of those things that is broad strokes in many different games that you're going to be running into. Do they just need to be covered? I think there will basically, after we've covered combat and after we've covered air operations, we'll have another large video after that where we mop up. We will just mop up and give some examples and readings of all those parts of the manual that haven't yet come up as we've looked at all these other larger concepts, right? And so that way we can look back across this list of everything that you're going to run into in OCS, and we could say, yep, somewhere in this series it's covered, right? So I appreciate your patience. I appreciate that you guys are checking out these videos and listening to what I have to say, despite the fact that I'm not a YouTuber and I do not have very good editing skills, and I'm not really as succinct as I could be. Obviously I'm not reading off a script, although I am following a basic structure. So with that being said, how about we hop into the game? How about we hop into today's video? Right. So what we're going to be covering today in a basic sense is reaction, overrun, ground combat, and all that entails. And then we will also cover barrage, the larger part of barrage, excluding air and naval barrage, and we will cover this section on the exploitation phase. That's quite a lot. It's really, we're talking about the meat in the patty right now. You know, if OCS is a burger, combat could be considered the meat, although some might argue that supply is the meat, but this is quite a thick section that we're dealing with here. You know, combat as well as exploitation and reaction and overrun, I find that they all tend to go in tandem, and it's going to be difficult for me to explain reaction without explaining overruns. It's going to be hard for me to explain ground combat without further on explaining exploitation. I believe that we can talk about all of them in one video, and we can use one sort of unified demonstration that I've created this little sandbox demonstration here with explaining all of these concepts in mind right here. And so without further ado, I believe that we can hop straight into it. So to give you an idea of what we're looking at right here, I have used the previous supply demonstrations as a template, and I've built upon that. I've added a few extra units here for the Axis and the Allies, right? The 1st Armored Division has a few extra units here in this valley area. He's got some artillery, he's got another tank unit. The British have entered the fray with some units in reserve, some units here, some units here. And I've beefed up the Germans to a small extent with a few extra units and some reserves and with extra supply for both sides. And what this means is that we can give a small example of play that encompasses reaction, overruns, combats, and exploitation as well. And it may not be the most all-encompassing example, but it will give you an idea of what we're looking at. And as usual, of course, we will start with the reading. I won't necessarily be reading in a linear fashion. For example, I'm not going to read reaction first, as it's not coming up first in this video, but everything will be read, and we will give examples after we read it. And the first thing I want to cover is overrun, what overrun is, and then, because overrun is ground combat. Now I know that might sound a little bit confusing, but overrun is just another form of ground combat. Ground combat governs what happens when combat units engage other combat units, and overrun is a form of combat, and that simply just means that people are moving and fighting. Right, now you might think, well, everybody moves and fights, nobody's standing still, it's not a 17th century duel. Well, traditionally in this game, ground combat, excluding overruns, exists between essentially statically located units adjacent to each other, speaking basically, right? Ground combat, as it's outlined in the manual, excluding overrun, does not occur while in the same segments that you're moving units. You know, if you take overrun out of the picture, you are only moving units in the movement segments, and then when the combat segments come up as part of the various phases, whether that be combat or exploitation phase, that is when you are conducting combat, which is rigid. It's quite rigid and not conducive to a fluid strategy, and that's why we have overrun, right? So I want to start this example of play in, let's say, a hypothetical allied movement phase. This turn will take place across an allied turn, including the Axis's reaction within that turn. So let's say that within this example of play, we are now in the allied movement phase. If you need a little reminder of that, that's right here in our turn summary, right? So forgetting weather and aircraft and reinforcement, let's just say we're right into a turn right now. The allies are moving, right? Forget breakout. We're in the movement segment of the movement phase. We are moving units around. And if I'm the allied player, I'm setting my eyes upon Gafsa. I would like to take Gafsa, and I would like to take it as soon as possible to disrupt German operations in this area, to take out a central location in their defensive lines. Right. So let's read about Overrun to find out how I can do that. Right. Just remember that we're in the movement phase right now, and as you can see, or I might be too far for you to be able to see, nothing here has moved. Right. I've got a set of units that have not yet moved. Right. Let's just assume that these guys here started the turn in reserve for whatever reason. Right. It's all perfectly fine. None of the allied units have moved yet. Right. So Overrun. Let's take a look. Overrun is a form of combat that occurs during the various movement segments. Only use these procedures against hexes with enemy combat units. Refer to 9.14 when moving into hexes that only contain non-combat units, ships, or planes. Now, on that note, we have covered a portion of 9.14 as far as it relates to capturing supply, capturing transport points, and disrupting extenders. We haven't yet covered anything relating to ships or aircraft or air bases, and we're going to cover what happens when these get captured by ground units in their respective videos for aircraft and ships, so don't worry too much about that. Right? What's important to remember that is Overrun does not concern non-combat units, and what happens when non-combat units enter hex, what happens when combat units, specifically attack-capable combat units, which is something to keep in mind when you look at the 9.14 rules. Only attack-capable units can capture non-combat units or have an effect on them. Right? However, when we're talking about combat units, not attack-capable combat units moving into hexes with non-combat units, that is governed in 9.14, not Overrun. Overrun, only use these procedures against hexes with enemy combat units. Simple as that. Right? So this really only concerns combat between combat units. Right? Procedure. Move the attacking stack adjacent to the target hex and declare the overrun. Overruns are made from the adjacent hex. The attacker do not actually enter the defender's hex unless the defender vacates it. For whatever reason, there may be many reasons, right? Well, only one, which would be destruction or retreat. Two, destruction or retreat, put it that way. Right? Resolve overruns like any other combat, and that's exactly what I'm saying, right? It's combat, it follows a combat sequence. Note, there is an increased chance for surprise, which is true in overruns. If the attacker does not retreat and has sufficient movement points remaining after an overrun, regardless of whether the defender retreats or is destroyed, he can continue to move and make further overruns against the same or other targets. If the defender retreats or is destroyed, all of the attacking units must enter the hex at no additional movement cost. Alright. Now, there is some restrictions on overruns, and this is probably the longest part of the overrun section. It's really important to remember these restrictions. And when I give the gameplay example, I'll try to represent as many of these restrictions as possible. So, Only attack-capable units that started the phase stacked together can overrun. This is very critical. They must be in combat, move, or exploitation mode. Units can overrun as many times as their movement allowance allows. There is no limit to the number of times a given defender can be overrunning during a single movement segment. Resolve each overrun separately. So 2 things to take very close note of here. Only attack-capable units can overrun, of course, because it's overrun as an attack. And they have to be stacked together at the start of the phase. You can't take different units together into one overrun if they didn't start the phase together. Mind you, if you've got this stack of 4, 5, 6 units in the same hex, yeah, you can overrun with those 4, 5, 6 units if they started in the same hex. But if you've got one unit here, one unit there, and they all start the phase in different hexes, they cannot come together like the Power Rangers and form into one overrun attack. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way with overruns, right? So there's no limit. Oh, and the other thing, they must be in combat, move, or exploitation mode. Now, I'm going to double check to make sure what I'm telling you is correct, but the implication of this is that units in DG mode cannot overrun, right? And the quickest way to check that is to just move back up to modes, check disorganized mode, and look at the effects of DG. Here we go. 5.10b, effects of DG, blah 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 blah, A, B, C, and C, they are unable to overrun or earn exploitation mode. So keep that in mind. If they are disorganized, they cannot overrun. That's another issue with overrun, but also an example to you of how you can cross-check the manual using the table of contents. Keep that in mind. Units can overrun as many times as the MA allows. There's no blah blah blah. Yep, right, cool. So that's another benefit of overruns, is that if you have enough movement points remaining, bear in mind they cost movement points to overrun. You have to spend it as if you're moving into a hex. If you have enough left, you can do it again. How much does it cost? Well, that's right here in the next section. Moving units spend 3 movement points for each overrun. If the combat result allows the attacker to occupy the defender's hex, there is no additional movement point cost to do so. Units with fewer than 3 movement points remaining cannot overrun. So overrun, while it is combat that costs movement points. You can't do it if you can't pay the movement points. Just like you can't move into a hex if you can't pay for that either. Right? There is an example here. A unit does 2 overrun attacks against a hex that would cost 1 movement point to enter. It is successful the second time and advances into the defender's hex with 6 MP expended, right? Let's take, let's take this guy right here as an example, right? Our friend here with 6 movement points, right? A unit that does 2 overrun attacks against a hex that would cost 1 movement point to enter, so let's just say this hex, for example, right? It's successful the second time. So this guy here could overrun, goodness, let's just generate a target here just for the sake of it. Right, this guy here could overrun here for the cost of 3 movement points. Remember, that's the cost each and every time, 3 movement points. And if he fails and doesn't retreat, let's just say he, the combat unfortunately just doesn't succeed, but he doesn't have to retreat, right? Or the defender's able to take enough losses to stay there. If he still has 3 movement points remaining, he can do it again. Just do it again until it's down to 0. In this case, he could do it twice and it would be down to 0. So that's just what this example is explaining. And I know that might sound a little confusing. Hopefully it'll make a bit more sense as we do a few gameplay examples. So overruns are only allowed if the movement point cost to enter the hex, the combined hex, hexside, and train busting costs would be 3 movement points or less. A terrain that lists the cost of all cannot be overrun. This is important, really important. Because train busting does affect overruns. What's train busting? Well, good question. It hasn't come up yet in this tutorial series because train busting relates to what aircraft do. And just to give you a brief preview of what train busting is, it is just a mission that aircraft can conduct over a specific area of the map that increases the movement point cost to move in that small geographical area of the map. right? And because it increases the cost, it also affects overruns. It doesn't affect everything, but it certainly does affect overruns, right? So combined hex, hex side, and train busting cost if applicable, right? Needs to be 3 movement points or less. A terrain that lists the cost of all cannot be overrun. Alright, and we're going to talk a lot more about that later as I attempt to do some overruns. Okay? I will give plenty of examples of that, but even more important is 8.1c. Units cannot use features such as roads or bridges to bring the hex's movement point cost down, to negate prohibited terrain, or to meet the restrictions of 6.1d. What's 6.1d? Let's just briefly refresh our memory on that one. Alright, again using the table of contents here. Alright, 6.1d, which is what we covered in depth in the movement video. The ABBA rule, the ABBA rule, right? A unit can only move from hex A to hex B, but could also do from hex B to hex A. I'm not going to get back into the depth of that rule. You should know how it works by now. If not, feel free to go back to my video where I cover it in detail. But this is very important for the sake of overruns. Because again, remember how ABBA prevents movement in certain circumstances. That means that it'll also prevent overruns as well, right? But further to that, units can't use features such as roads or bridges either. So it's like the ABBA rule, even worse. Even worse. Because now roads and bridges don't count. You just have to stick with the raw cost of terrain. So overrunning can be quite difficult in certain terrain situations. And I'll give some examples of that when we get into the play. Each overrun is made against a single adjacent enemy hex. A given hex can be overrun several times in a single phase. Yeah, we basically already went over that. The same moving stack can make several overruns against the same or different hexes. So long as they're moving in the same stack from the same point of origin, you can conduct as many overruns as you want within the bounds of terrain and your movement allowance, right? Remember that your movement allowance is going to go down by 3 every time you commit an overrun, right? No unit, regardless of combat result, ever gains exploitation marker when making an overrun. Now, exploitation will be covered in this video later. What it is and how it works we will get to, but just keep in mind that one of the crucial parts of exploitation, which is the reward of an exploitation marker, which comes from combat, is not attainable from overrun. Why? That will make a lot more sense as we get to the end of the video, so don't worry too much about that for now. Alright. Now, should the attacking units choose to take one or more of their options, and again we're going to get into what options are, but should they need to take one or more of their options as a retreat from an overrun, they end their movement for the phase. The attackers can continue movement if they do not retreat. So remember that if you want to commit multiple overruns against a hex, you have to make sure you don't retreat, or else that's it. It's over for that stack. They're not going anywhere else. Right? That stack or individual unit, they're not going anywhere else. Right? Only units conducting the overrun can move in an overrunning stack. Right? It's pretty common sense. Right? Only units conducting an overrun can move in an overrunning stack. You can't have people tagging along. Right? Other friendly units can be in the hex in which an overrun is made. These units affect stacking limits, but are not involved in the overrun. And the overrun's combat result has no effect on these units whatsoever. So we'll also have some examples of that too. Right? Now, before I even get into how combat works, let's just give some examples of some attempted overruns that sort of cover a lot of these restrictions that the manual outlines, right? Let's just say, for example, I've got this big kahuna over here from the 1st Armored Division, and I want to commit some overruns with him against some of these enemy units that are nearby, right? So, let's just say he's fueled up, right? And now we want to do an overrun. Now, I go here, I want to overrun this guy. He's in a mountain hex. Alright, what's the cost of a mountain hex? For track or truck, it's prohibited. But hold on, there's a road going through there, right? If I was just moving, I could just go through there for the cost of 1 movement point. So there's a track. So surely I should be able to... No, you cannot overrun, right? Units cannot use features such as roads or bridges to bring down the hex movement cost, or to negate prohibited terrain. right? And here we have prohibited terrain with a road going through it. If the enemy wasn't obstructing it, yeah, sure, I could go straight through, thanks to the road. But for the purposes of this overrun, this road may as well not exist. So I'm trying to overrun prohibited terrain. No, no. For that very same reason, I couldn't overrun this artillery, right? He's on a track, which again, track is only one movement point, and if there was no enemy resistance here, I could move straight through the mountain using the track, right? Or the railway, the railroad track. It's the same thing in the game context, right? But I can't. However, right? Let's move them back one hex for the sake of argument. Let's find out if it's possible now, right? Because again, he can get here within 3 movement points, so he'll have 3 movement points remaining for an overrun, in theory. Same here, 1, 2, he has 3 movement points remaining for an overrun. But can he overrun? Let's ask the question, right? Let's start over here. 1, 2, 3. Okay, I've entered this mountain hex through the track. I can do that because it's not occupied by enemy soldiers, right? And what kind of hex is the enemy in now? Let's just quickly turn off the counters. He's only in rough. He's in rough terrain, right? Now let me just bring up the terrain effects chart a little bit bigger so you guys can see what I'm talking about a little easier, right? Right, so we got rough terrain, right? And that's actually 3 for track, right? Now remember, from what we read, right, overruns are only allowed if the MP cost to enter the hex, the combined hex side, and train busting, although I'm not including train busting as part of this, right, would be 3 movement points or less. Terrain that lists the cost of all cannot be overrun. So what is this listing? Well, it's listing 3 or less, right? So can we overrun? No. Unfortunately, sip of coffee. No, we cannot. Why is that, right? I mean, yeah, just like we talked about before, we have to pretend that the road's not there for the purposes of this overrun. But it's rough. Rough is 3. Why can't he overrun? Well, units cannot use features such as roads or bridges to bring a hex's MP cost down. That's not a problem here. Or to negate prohibited terrain. Also not a problem. Or to meet the restriction of 6.1d, and that is where we find our problem here. We are starting from a mountain hex. Now, if you remember our in-depth example from the movement video, again, I can just go back to 6.1d here. A unit can move from hex A to hex B only if it could also move from hex B to hex A. For example, a unit prohibited from entering mountains could not move from a mountain hex to a clear hex through a non-road hex side. Note the possible impact on overruns, which cannot make use of roads. Right? So because a unit can only move from hex A to hex B, only if it could also move from hex B to hex A, let's take a look at that in the context of there being no roads here, because it's an overrun. We have to ignore roads in the case of an overrun. So what does this mean? Right? What does this mean? What it means is that, if I just turn this off again, because he's moving from a mountain hex into a rough hex, that's AB, but he couldn't move from a rough hex into a mountain hex without the road, this overrun is prohibited. Now this is probably one of the most finicky, difficult to comprehend parts of OCS. It's why I made a specific section covering it in the movement video, and if you were able to understand its implications in the movement video, it shouldn't be too difficult for you to understand exactly what I'm talking about here when looking at overruns, right? The only difference here simply being that when it comes to overruns, roads cannot be used for factoring in the cost of an overrun, right? The movement costs. So an overrun costs 3 movement points. You can do it if the hex you're entering costs 3 movement points or less, but roads are not applicable, and 6.1d, the ABBA rule, is still applicable. So you need to be very careful not to break the rules with this one, right? These guys cannot rush out of these mountains and attack. You may need to repeat this section a number of times to get what I'm talking about. You may need to do a few examples of play yourself on the board to really get the hang of it. But for those very same reasons, he couldn't attack. He couldn't go 1, 2 and attack here either. for those same reasons, right? Not just for the fact that this wadi increases the cost of moving into this hex beyond 3, so an overrun would not be possible in the first place. But again, the fact that he is coming from a mountain hex means it's just not possible, right? Furthermore, could I just go around? Could I go 1, 2, 3? No. Again, in the context of movement, that's not allowed. I can't leave this mountain hex into an open hex without a road because of the ABBA rule, right? Movement is the most common thing you'll do in this game, and the ABBA rule is something that you need to be very careful not to break, because if you start breaking the ABBA rule, you start to remove some of the best defensive aspects of terrain in OCS, and you're really shortchanging your enemy, unfortunately, right? So now that we've sort of taken a look at most of the examples of overrun restrictions that you're going to be running into, the only ones I think I didn't really quite cover there is DG. You know, like, again, if this unit was DG'd, he couldn't do any of those overruns to begin with anyway, right? Let's actually do an overrun that we can do and take a look at what it looks like. So let's take this 6 armored, right? I should probably have a formation marker for them. Let's do that. Let's go by the book, shall we? All right, 6 armored division. I'll have their formation marker. I'll keep their formation marker on the reserves. Now, this is kind of like a bit of an Easter egg from the, or at least a connection to the previous video where we talked about supply. In terms of fueling these units, this is one of those situations where using a divisional fueling of this 6 armor division will be advantageous, because I'm intending to move these units now. I'm intending to release some of these units as part of my exploitation. I'm intending to do quite a number of different things that are going to have quite a prohibitively large fuel cost. You know, if I'm paying the 1T method, just to fuel the whole division will cost 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6T. Why would I do that? So it's time to use the divisional fueling method. 1 supply point fuels the 6 armored for the remainder of this turn. I don't have to sit around wondering about which one's fueled and which one isn't, right? Yes, the 1st armored should have a divisional marker around here somewhere. Why don't we just put one down for them, just for the sake of being a bit more realistic here. Alright, so I've filled these guys up, and I want to overrun GAFSA, and I want to overrun GAFSA with these 2 armored units. Alright, I'm going to use this overrun also as an example of ground combat. This will be like the first ground combat that we run through, right? But I'm going to use this example to show you an overrun. Before we even get into combat, this is an example of an overrun that I can do, right? Now, before I do that, I want to show you one more restriction, right? I've got these guys here, right? And let's say I want to move them up adjacent to GAFSA. And they've just used 1 movement point to do that. And now they've got 2 movement points left. Can they overrun GAFSA? No. They don't have enough movement points, right? It took them 1 movement point to move from here to here. Furthermore, this guy is not attack capable. Parenthesize combat rating. Keep that in mind. Cannot attack whatsoever. But they're just going to be there. They're just going to be friendly combat units in this hex, and I'm going to commit the overrun with these guys. Remember that other friendly units can be in the hex in which an overrun is made. It affects the stacking limit, which we'll get into in a later video. It's not super relevant right now, but are not involved in the overrun. The overrun's combat result has no effect on these units whatsoever, regardless of what it is. Right? Have we covered the stacking limit? That's a good question. No, we haven't. Guess that'll have to come up in Fog of War. Right. So these guys' fuel is paid for, right? And they're moving along a secondary road, which is half price for movement, as we covered in the movement video. Remember, we're not doing the overrun yet. The overrun is declared and paid for when you make it adjacent to the enemy unit. So we're going to go 1, 2, which is just regular movement. And here these guys are, and we're going to overrun GAFSA, right? Now, can we overrun GAFSA? right? Just turning off the units to show you what's underneath GAFSA. It's a little village. Let's take a look at the terrain effects chart, right? Village. OT. Have we spoken about this before? Maybe, maybe not, right? OT means other terrain, right? Dependent on the other terrain in the hex. So we're not going to be using the village as a movement cost here, right? There's a lot of things like villages and cities and points of interest where they inherently do not have a movement cost of their own. The movement cost is whatever is underneath the hex, and in this case, that's open, right, which costs 1. So in the context of, is this too expensive to overrun? The answer is no. It's not too expensive. In the context of, do these two units here that they started together, so we're already okay in that regard. Furthermore, do they have enough movement points? They started here. 1, 2. How many movement points do they have left? If this is 5, 3. They have 3 movement points left. So they are permitted to overrun in this particular circumstance, right? Last thing, I'm sure you've probably noticed that we are overrunning from this hex of rough terrain into this hex of open terrain. Is this prohibited? Does the ABBA rule apply here? What happens, right? Well, remember that the AB, so you're right, I'm not using any roads in the context of overrunning GAFSA, and I can't. I'm simply overrunning from this rough terrain hex into this open terrain hex. Is that legal? Well, the ABBA rule is simple. Can he move from, if he's moving from A to B, can he move from B to A? Is it prohibited? Right? Is rough terrain prohibited to track? No. Cost aside, the ABBA rule does not concern itself with cost. It concerns itself with whether something is prohibited or not. And in this case, it's not prohibited for track to enter rough terrain. So the ABBA rule will not be stopping us from committing this overrun. Alright, so we are all clear to overrun GAFSA. And so with that being said, that is your demonstration of the governing rules of overruns. And now we're going to be doing combat. So let's jump into the manual again, and we're going to be reading about combat. This is a particularly large section of the manual. It's about 1.5, 2.5, 3.5, 4, 5. Yeah, it's big. Alright, so this is going to take a while, although there are certain things we don't need to read yet. We're not going to read about exploit results until we need to, until we're covering exploitation. Specialized combats, we need to cover some of it, although some of it we've already covered, so we can skip some of it in regards to supply points, transports, and extenders. At least we've covered that, and that is most of 9.14 at the very least. Right? Furthermore, a lot of other specialized combats we're going to cover in other videos as well. So really the bread of what we're going to be covering here is looking at the overview, looking at the procedure, looking at the sequence summary, restrictions, how terrain affects various things, anti-tank, right? Supplying combat, right? Which we have covered before to a certain extent, so we don't have to get too deep into now. Action ratings, odds, surprise, various other things. Combat resolution, results, options, step losses. We'll get through all of it. Yeah, well, in any case, there's quite a lot to get through, and for that matter, step losses are something that I will probably need to... I will have to use Smolensk for that, which I will do in this video just as a special example, as unfortunately Tunisia does not have units that can take step losses, that is, multi-step formations. So, without further ado, let's get through this gargantuan reading process. Ground combat 9.0. Ground combat is conducted in the combat segments of the combat phase and exploitation phase. Overruns also use the ground combat procedure, but with some differences as outlined in section 8.0. What that functionally means is that once you actually get to the combat, the only thing that's actually different is surprise and a little bit about the consequences of how you execute the result, but otherwise it's identical combat system, right? To engage in combat, the attacking units must be adjacent to the hex being attacked. There are some other important considerations. Units that are not attack capable can never attack. Right? We've covered that before. HQ and artillery are combat units that do not have a printed combat strength. We have covered that before. Artillery ships and planes do not attack enemy ground units using regular combat. They attack using barrage. We will cover that in the future. Hexes that do not contain enemy combat units cannot be attacked. Such hexes are dealt with by specialized combats. Okay, phone calls are just things that happen when you're trying to record a video, but where were we? Yeah, hexes that do not contain enemy combat unit cannot be attacked, blah blah blah. Yep, right. We've covered that before. Supply dumps, transport points, air bases, plane ships do not take part in regular combat at all. They do not add strength or absorb any loss, and except for organic trucks, they cannot retreat. Keep that in mind, that organic trucks do have a special characteristic in that regard. Whenever enemy attack capable units enter a hex with these units, a specialized combat occurs. Right? Now, here is the combat procedure, which is quite long and arduous, and don't worry if it doesn't make much sense right now. It will make more sense as we do demonstrations over the course of the video. And so let's get into it. The attacker announces the attacking hexes. And by hexes, you can attack, if it's a regular attack, not an overrun, from multiple different hexes. You can, adjacent hexes, that is. But there can only ever be one defending hex, keep that in mind. Before determining any odds or modifiers, both sides must put their involved combat units into combat supply by expending supply points according to the supply table or by expending internal stocks. The attacker does this first, and if he cannot do so, the attack is cancelled, and the defender does not need to expend any supply. If the defender does not expend supply or has none, the attack continues, but the defender fights at half combat strength. Each side selects a unit whose action rating will lead the combat. Subtract the defender's AR from the attacker's AR and use the difference as a DRM, affecting both surprise determination and a combat roll. Roll 2 dice for surprise to check for possible surprise shifts to the combat table. Determine the base combat table odds by comparing the combat strengths for each side, making all adjustments for mode, terrain, supply, as a ratio of attacker to defender. Round fractions per the rounding rule. On the combat table, locate the correct odds column on the appropriate terrain category row. If either player has surprise, adjust the table column accordingly. Roll 2 dice, modifying the roll by the DRM for action rating and any hedgehog the defender might have. Cross-index the modified roll with the odds column to find out the combat result. Apply that result, starting with a unit of each side whose AR was used to determine surprise. Yeah, talk about word soup. Alright, I wouldn't expect you at all to understand most of that if it's your first time hearing it. It does sound complicated, but you experienced players execute this process sometimes in a matter of seconds. Okay, once you know how it works, it's quite quick. Before I proceed any further, I want to go back up in the manual and cover some general concepts that haven't been covered before. That is fractions, cumulative effects, and the rounding rule. Just in case I need to cover this, I just want this to be a bit more in detail before we get into combat. Rounding rule, players will often be required to round decimals to whole numbers. When the fractional part is less than 0.5, round down. When the fractional part is 0.5 or more, round up. Simple stuff, right? Fractions. Round the final odds in combat, but do not round fractional strengths prior to determining odds. Fractional barrage factors are combined and then rounded to determine the barrage column. Excuse me. Never round fractional movement allowances. Players should take note of the important effect of the rounding rule to odds calculation. Yeah, we'll get into that. It's quite significant, but I'll get into it later in the video. Right? Now, we're not talking about movement allowances in this term, but just keep in mind that fractions have different meanings depending on which fractions you're dealing with, right? Last but not least, cumulative effects. In all cases where a value is subject to multiple modifiers, the effects are cumulative. For instance, quarter the strength of a combat unit, half for terrain and half for supply. I will give some examples of this, but just keep that in mind. Terrain effects and other status effects, etc., mode effects, they can be cumulative, so keep that in mind. Alright. back to our reading. All right, now we've just read the procedure. Let's read some restrictions. All right. Only the phasing player's units can attack in a combat segment, and only the moving player's units can overrun in a movement segment. It's pretty common sense, but just keep it in mind. Right? Attacking is always voluntary, and just part of a stack can be used if the player wants. No unit can divide its strength to attack more than one hex, nor can multiple defending hexes be attacked. Keep that in mind. In one combined combat. Except for stacking, there is no limit on the number of units that can engage in a combat from a single hex. There are some important differences between regular combats and overruns, in addition to things covered in 8.0. In a combat segment, a given unit may attack only once, and a given hex may be attacked only once. A hex can be attacked from as many adjacent hexes as the attacking player wants. In a movement segment, given units may perform multiple overruns, and there is no limit on how many times a given hex can be attacked via overrun. Only the current moving stack can overrun, so overruns must come from a single adjacent hex, right? So again, that's a primary difference between overruns, as we were discussing before, and the combat that we're discussing now, right? Overruns are an exception to this top rule, in which in a combat segment you can only attack once, and a given hex can only be attacked once. A hex can be attacked from as many adjacent hexes as the player wants. That's regular combat, right? And then obviously in a movement segment we covered that, right? That's the biggest difference. That's what overrun is, right? Right. So this top section here is fundamentally what regular combat, as we would call it, is. This section is what overrun is, if you're wondering, if you want a concrete example of the difference, right? Attack all combat units in a hex as a single combined defensive strength. The defender can never withhold units in a hex from combat, right? But just keep in mind that only combat units are applicable, and so on. Units can be restricted in their ability to attack by mode. Units in strat mode and unreleased reserves cannot attack. Supply status, requisite supply points or eternal stocks not available. Terrain, see 9.1F, and unit type, parenthesized combat strengths can only defend. Fuel is not needed to attack or defend, keep that in mind. A unit can never attack a hex that the movement rules, specifically 6.1D and 6.2C, prohibit it from entering. Right? This applies even if the TEC seems to indicate otherwise. Note also that a hex can be entered in movement, but only by road. A regular combat is allowed, but not an overrun. Now this is pretty critical to understand, because it's a tool in your toolbox for navigating the 6.1D issue, right? So generally speaking, 6.1D still applies in most circumstances, right? And it still prohibits attacking per the ABBA rule and all that various things. But in this case, roads have a slightly different relationship to regular combat than they do to overruns. All right, roads basically don't exist for the sake of overruns, but they can allow a combat where otherwise it may not be possible. All right. And if you take a look at the TEC, it'll give you a better idea of what this means, right? When you see an asterisk on a terrain special modifier, right, it means you can attack via a road or a railroad if movement is prohibited per OCS 9.1F, and here we have 9.1F here. So we'll have some better examples of that in the gameplay, right? Resolve attacks that begin past or are shifted past odds shown on the table using the last available column. We'll get into that as well. Also, attacks with odds which begin off the table have column shifts measured from the last available column. And there is an example of this if you need to make a bit more sense out of that. But I will show how that works in the demonstrations, right? We have a sequence summary here. I'm not going to read this right now because I'm going to read it probably 5 or 6 times over the course of this video, because I'm going to read this sequence summary every time I do a combat, right? And so should you until you know it off by heart, right? And even if you do know it off by heart, come back to it often because it's easy to forget, right? More importantly, terrain in the combat table, right? The combat table divides terrain into 4 general terrain categories, right? And you know what? I'm just going to open this up if I can. to the left so we can take a better look at what it's talking about here. Alright, let's open this up, take a closer look. Alright, because I really want to show you exactly what I'm talking about as I'm talking about it. The combat table divides terrain into 4 general terrain categories: open, close, very close, and extremely close, which isn't present here in Tunisia, but it is present in Smolensk. If I was to go to the bottom of the Smolensk manual, you can see that major cities in Smolensk are extremely close. Right? These categories define the row to be indexed on the odds column. We'll get to that. Always use the defender's hex or hex size to determine the terrain category, not the attacker's. Right? Units must be able to move into a hex being attacked. See 9.1F. Again, it's very critical to understand that. Right? The terrain effects on the combat chart will usually mark with an asterisk a situation where combat might not be possible if hexes are not connected by road. But 9.1F always applies, whether or not an asterisk or not is on the chart. Right? So again, asterisks are really where you want to be paying close attention to see if your attack is possible or not. Right? If movement is prohibited, you can attack via road or railroad, and that will usually still induce a heavy penalty to your attacking capabilities, but it will be possible to attack. Right? Multiple terrain types. Some hexes include more than one terrain symbol, such as woods and mountains. The defender gets to choose which one of these terrain types affects the combat. The amount of the terrain symbol in the hex does not matter, except in the case of cities and villages, where spillover is ignored. Right? So just keep that in mind, that it's not a case of you always have to use the worst or whatever is perceived to be the worst terrain. The defender chooses which that he wants to use. That's how it works in this regard. Right? The effect of terrain on attacking and defending units and the terrain's combat table are found in the game's terrain effects charts, which we were just looking at before. Right? And here we can, so that was terrain in the combat table and how you read the combat table. And now we're going to take a look at terrain and unit strength. Bear with me. This reading is exhaustive, but I will be giving as many demonstrations as possible of how this works when we get into the nitty-gritty of it. Right? Terrain and unit strength. Combat units are divided into 3 classes: armor, mech, and other. You know what, let's just bring this bad boy back up with us, because he's not done yet. We still need you. Come here, buddy. Alright? Armor, mech, other. Alright? Armor, mech, and other. The combat strength of units in each class is sometimes modified by terrain, which is all this that you see here. Right? For instance, attacking armor is usually 2 times in the open. Right? Apply terrain effects to every unit independently. Some might be halved, some might be quartered, etc. Right? The defending player gets to choose the one terrain that will modify each attacking stack. Right? Either a type in the defender's hex, such as mountains or woods, or along the hex side, such as rivers or wadi. Right? This is a separate decision for each attacking stack. Remember, only the hex or the hex side can be chosen. These modifiers are not cumulative. Alright? And I'll give some examples of that in the demonstration. The defending player also gets to choose the one terrain that will modify the defending stack. This choice is not restricted by the selections made in 9.4b. Right? Only the hex terrain, not hex side, can be chosen. Right? So you can't use the hex side to affect your own defending units, only the attacking unit. This choice also determines the terrain category line to be used in the combat table. Just to let you know, by the way, I'm going to be generating 5 or 6 different combats to show you the consequences and the procedures for each in various different situations. So don't worry if you're sitting here thinking, my god, so many rules that apply to so many different situations. I'll do my best to show you each different situation in regards to hexes, hex sides, terrain effects, etc. And AT effects, which we're about to come up onto. If a terrain effect is in brackets, that modifier only applies to attacking units. On defense, all such bracketed modifiers are read as ×1. Right? You'll notice here there is quite a few brackets here. these brackets only apply to attackers, and defenders is ×1, right? This is to indicate situations where attacking is disadvantageous for the attacker and either advantageous or neutral for the defender. This coffee tastes terrible. Anti-tank effects. A ×2 terrain effect for attacking armor and mech is sometimes reduced to 1.5. Do this when the defender's hex has the same or higher level of AT effects. Again, there will be demonstrations, so don't worry too much about this, right? Heavy AT effects are given to all yellow-coded units, red-coded units with tank symbols, and units with anti-tank or anti-aircraft symbols and hedgehogs, right? And you know what? Let's pull out some examples of this, right? Here we have right here a yellow-coded unit. As we discussed in the unit section, this unit is yellow-coded, all right? Right here, we have a red-coded unit on the side of the Germans, right? That's light AT, right? So heavy AT is given to yellow-coded units, red-coded units with a tank symbol, such as Soviet tank brigades. I can just bring up so I've got Smolensk open here for step losses, but I can also bring up a tank division for the Soviets, right? Let's pull up. See this right here? This multi-step tank division? That's red, but it has a tank symbol in it. Red-coded units with tank symbols, such as Soviet tank brigades, have heavy AT. Why? Well, I can just explain this right here, right? Well, actually, the manual will explain it, so I'll save myself from work on that one. But that, just keep in mind, that has heavy AT, not light AT, even though it's red, right? Units with anti-tank or anti-aircraft symbols. Let's see, where can we find some of those? I'm sure we can find them in Tunisia, right? If you don't know NATO symbology, this symbol with a V in it is anti-tank. And if it was upside down, it would be anti-air, which also has heavy AT. Where can I find it would probably be a Luftwaffe, here we go, right? That is an anti-aircraft symbol, right? An upside down V, or like a triangle, right? That symbol right there, that's anti-aircraft. That symbol right here, that's anti-tank. Both of which have heavy AT. Keep that in mind. It'll take a little while to wrap your head around that. Right? Light AT is given to all red code units which do not have a tank symbol. So like I said before, our friend right here, right, the armored recon for the Germans, right, and also this battle group, right, for the Americans, light AT, right, and every other unit has no AT, right. Consider AT reductions to attack multiplier on an individual unit basis, right. So what this basically means is that, you know, when attacking in open terrain, and again, you'll see functionally how this works throughout the demonstrations, certain units, yellow and red coded units, can take advantage of just a 2x modifier for armor and mech in open terrain, right? You'll find that this is almost universal across most OCS games in most circumstances, right? However, that 2x is brought down to 1.5 when do this when the defender's hex has the same or higher level of AT effects. So if heavy AT attacks heavy AT, the 2x becomes 1.5. If mech attacks mech, 2x becomes 1.5 in open terrain, right? However, if heavy AT attacks light AT, the 2x remains 2x. If mech attacks something with no AT, the 2x remains 2x, right? If mech attacks armor, the 2x becomes 1.5x, because again, it becomes 1.5 when the defender's hex has the same or higher level of AT effects. Heavy AT is stronger than light AT, right? Let's just read the design note to get a better idea here. These anti-tank effects show the reduction in the offensive power of mechanized units when confronted by defenses prepared for their threat. As a side benefit, they bring out the hard yet soft character of most red mech units. Note that red mech units with a tank symbol, and only that exact symbol, are a special case because they have an inherent infantry strength as well as tanks, right? So that special case that we were looking at here with the Soviet tank division, again, heavy AT, but for all other purposes they are mechanized. What does that mean? Well, what it essentially means is that they don't suffer from a lot of the other penalties that pure yellow coated units would in combat situations, because of the fact that they have a bit of soft targets with them in the case of infantry. They're a combined arms unit, right? That may not make a lot of sense to you if you're new to all this, but it's just remember the rule. You don't have to worry about the historical context, right? And there is an example here if you need it, but I will give some play examples as well. All right, supply and combat we can just briefly go over because we covered it in the supply video, but I will be supplying these units for combat anyway, so you can see it again. Both combat supply and trace supply are needed to fight at full effectiveness. Being marked out of supply affects unit strength independently of the combat supply concerns, and all such reductions, if any, are cumulative, just like we discussed with the cumulative rule. All right? Units cannot attack at all without combat supply. Keep that in mind, right? Units without combat supply can defend at half strength. A player can choose to withhold combat supply if he so desires, right? Internal stocks can only be used when regular supply is physically unavailable, right? Exceptions: supply points loaded on an organic truck is exempt from this. Just keep that in mind, right? We discussed that when we discussed organic trucks, right? But really, I think maybe at some point organic trucks really need their own video because they have broad applications across the rule set. Alright. Design note: this rule prevents players from relying on internal stocks instead of using supply points in situations where a unit involved is pretty likely to die anyway. That would allow for far too much micromanagement, in effect getting a free combat. Allowing a unit to defend without supply is a safety valve for tight situations where the defending player might otherwise be the target of a supply soak-off attack. Right? The nuance of this is really hard to get a grip on until you've played a few games, but you'll eventually see what it means. Alright? Now, when marked out of supply, which we discussed that in the previous supply video, a unit with combat supply can still attack and defend, but does so at half strength. The same unit with no combat supply cannot attack at all and defends at quarter strength. Modifications are addition to any possible mode modification, so again it's cumulative, right? So this can be pretty devastating in bad circumstances, right? Combat supply is paid the instant of combat using either supply or internal stocks, right? It can't be saved up for later and paid later, right? There's examples here, but I will have my own examples for you guys, right? And boy, oh boy, do we have much more to get through. Right, much more. We will read all the way up until advance after combat, and we'll leave exploit for when we're dealing with exploit results. So, continuing on, my friends. Right, today we're going to look at action rating modifier. Action rating affects combat as dice roll modifiers. Right, each player selects a unit and that will determine his side's action rating in the combat, with the attacker announcing his choice first. Only one unit is chosen per side, and the unit must actively participate in the combat. Calculate the DRM as follows: attacker AR minus defender AR equals DRM. This number can be positive or negative. This DRM is used when determining surprise and combat resolution. This is a critical part of combat, and we will be covering it in depth throughout the demonstrations, but just keep in mind that middle number that we first discussed in video number 2 concerning units is what's relevant to this, the middle number, the AR. Right? It doesn't add up. You're selecting one unit is chosen for its AR. You don't combine ARs of different units in the stack, you choose one AR, right? But again, we'll give demonstrations of this. Important note: each side's first step lost, if any, in a combat result must be taken from the action rating unit. This does not apply to losses taken in barrage or retreats. Alright? In those cases, the owning player can take a loss from any of the involved units. Alright? See 9.11c for more detail. Yeah. We will be getting to that shortly. Right, mode considerations. Modes can reduce action ratings. DG reduces action rating by 1. Strat mode reduces a unit's action rating to 0. Keep that in mind. Right. I will be throwing in some DGs and trying to inflict some DGs with artillery as we go. So you can see how DG affects combat, because it is, DG and combat go hand in hand. They are definitely two things that you're going to be working with at the same time quite a lot. Right. Odds determination. my favorite. To determine the raw combat odds, use the total modified attacking strength and total modified defending strength. Divide both by the smaller of them and apply the rounding rule to each result. Express the result as a ratio of attacker to defender. The combat table has a row for each terrain category. Find the odds determined above on the correct row using the terrain in the defender's hex. Use the highest column that is less than or equal to the determined rounded odds. Very critical. We'll be showing that in the gameplay, right? Odds are limited to those printed on the table. Resolve attacks that fall outside of the odds listed on the table on the last available column and begin any shifts from there. See also 9.1g, right, which we already discussed. Surprise! Another fun part of this game. I'm not going to be reading the play hints or design notes. I will just be giving demonstrations myself as to how this works. After players have identified their action rating units and have determined the combat odds, check for surprise. Roll 2 dice and add the DRM determined in 9.6. Subtract 1 from that roll if the defender has any level of hedgehog. Check the modified roll on the surprise table to determine which player, if any, gets surprise. If surprise occurs, roll 1 die and shift the final odds column on that combat table that number of columns. These shifts are to the right for the attacker, surprise, and left for defender surprise. If no surprise occurs, make no shifts. Note that the type of attack, overrun or regular, determines the surprise roll needed for each side. Right, whew, there's a lot to that, and it is a very important part of combat. Huge. It will affect things in various ways that you may not expect. But again, it's quite difficult to understand what I just read without demonstration, so we will get to that soon. Right, there's a whole lot of examples here. I'm not going to be reading those. You can read them in your own time if you're learning from the manual, but I will have demonstrations, right? Combat resolution. After determining odds, surprise and any column shifts, roll 2 dice. Add the action rating DRM and subtract the full value of any hedgehog in the defender's hex. Cross-index the modified dice roll with the final odds and find the result. Execute the results according to cases 9.10 and 9.13 below. Important note, hedgehogs have a surprise DRM that is different from the combat table DRM. Surprise rolls are -1 regardless of hedgehog level, while combat rolls are reduced by the full level of the hedgehog. Right? Again, that's a little difficult to grasp part of the rules, but you just have to follow exactly what it's written and you won't mistake that rule. Right? Lovely part of OCS is unfortunately there's no computer that will govern all these things, and it's very easy for us to break the rules if we're not paying attention. Which is why it's good to take notes and good to reread the rules as much as possible. Results and options. Combat results are generally a mixture of losses and options. Losses are given as an L, followed by a number. Options are given as an O, followed by a number. The loss number is required step loss. The option number presents the affected player with a choice. Right? See 9.11 for information about step losses, and see 9.12 on details on the retreats. Option results can be taken as any combination of step losses and retreat hexes, provided the total number is fully executed. For instance, a loss of 1 step combined with a retreat of 1 hex satisfies an O2 result. The attacker always goes first, executing this combat result before the defender decides what he will do. Take hard losses first and then any options. Alright? The defender gets to ignore his options if the attacker has retreated or cannot take all of his options, but the defender can choose to apply his full option when he wants to retreat. The attacker must always fulfill his option results. Right? When a combat result contains both options and exploitation numbers, the attacker must take his entire option as a loss to earn that exploit marker. If the attacker chooses to retreat, ignore the exploit result entirely. And here we have plenty of examples, but I will have examples in my gameplay, so don't worry about that. Step losses, and there will be demonstrations of this, and I will do combats. I will make a few combats in Smolensk to show you how these things work, right? Most units have just 1 step and are placed in the dead pile when they take a loss, hence Tunisia, right? A multi-step unit is less brittle and has 1 step per RE, right? Which we've covered before in the units video. Record their losses with a step loss marker placed underneath the unit. When the marker equals the unit's total steps, put it in the dead pile. No unit can ever absorb more than one step loss than it has available. The owning player determines which units or units absorb step losses within the restrictions of 9.11c. Alright. The result given as an L followed by a number must be taken as step losses. Ignore losses inflicted beyond the side's ability to absorb them. Alright. Step loss distribution. During combat, the AI unit must lose the first step of their side. In the case of multiple losses, all units must take one loss before any unit takes two. Keep that in mind. These distribution rules do not apply to losses taken during a barrage or retreat. Instead, the player has full control over which units to lose, so the AR unit need not take the first loss, and there is no requirement to spread out losses. Keep in mind there is a very popular optional rule to randomize barrage losses, but I'm not including that as part of this tutorial as it is an optional rule. Alright, moving on, there's quite a great deal of comprehensive combat examples here that I do recommend reading if you're learning from the manual, but I'll be doing my own gameplay examples here. Effective step losses. A multi-step unit missing one or more steps halves its combat strength when it attacks. If it is missing half or more of its original printed steps, the combat strength is halved also on defense. A multi-steps division's current regimental equivalent size is the unit's printed RE minus the steps it's lost. Right, just to make that clear, a unit's missing one or more steps halves its combat strength when it attacks. However, if it's not missing half of its original steps, it's still full strength on defense, right? And I will give some examples of that as we go through, right? Retreats and advances. Options that are not taken as step losses must be taken as a retreat. All units involved must retreat a number of hexes equal to the remaining option result. A retreat must end the full distance as the crow flies, aka straight line, or as straight as hexes can be, from the hex where it began, right? A retreat path does not have to be a straight line. It can zigzag to avoid prohibited terrain, but then must be extended to reach a hex satisfying the full distance requirement. Eliminate units that must retreat through enemy-occupied hexes or prohibited terrain. Sometimes this limits how much of an option can be taken as a retreat. The DG result on the combat table forces all defending units to immediately enter DG mode. Do this before beginning any retreat, important due to 9.12e. A retreat or two or more hexes triggers a DG result the instant a combat unit enters the second hex of its retreat. 9.12b. Units with a 0 MA can change to move mode before retreating. Units that are unable to move in any mode are destroyed if forced to retreat and cannot advance from combat either. Direction. Players retreat their own units. Retreating units can retreat as a stack or split up. A retreat should generally be away from enemy units involved in the combat, but to avoid losses, retreating units are allowed to bend the definition of what is locally to the rear. Probably the most ambiguous and difficult to understand definition in all of OCS, but the times it'll come up are probably once or twice a game, right? Try to work with your opponent to come up with a reasonable result in these situations, right? Tag-alongs. Combat units and organic trucks that did not participate in the combat can join a retreat from their hex. Other types of units such as ships, aircraft, ports, hedgehogs, non-organic trucks, and supply dumps cannot tag along and must remain in the hex. Keep that in mind. Then they are subject to 9.14 specialized combats, right? 9.12e, enemy zone of control. When a combat unit's retreats through a zone of control, it immediately changes to DG mode, as do any friendly combat units that just happen to be in the hex. In addition, if any part of the retreating hex was DG before it entered the enemy zone of control, lose one step from the hex. Lose one step from the stack, owning player's choice from among the retreating DG units. This zone of control effect cannot be negated by friendly combat units and is never affected by terrain, right? There is a design note to explain this, but I'll give it a quick read. The enemy ZOC's rule might need some explaining. Retreats are an unplanned form of movement, so even if a unit retreats into a hex protected by friendly units, the result is great confusion. This is why both the retreating unit and the units that it retreats through become DG. But just keep in mind that losses are only taken from retreating DG units, not units in the hex that they're retreating into, but they all do become DG. Right? Again, the intricacies of that I'll try to display in various gameplay examples. I'm going to have examples in this, but I'm also going to use Splints to come up with a bunch of other examples just to show the procedure again and again and again until people can understand it confidently, right? Advance after combat, right? Wait, hold on, I need to read this part first. Enemy units. A retreat cannot go through a hex that contained enemy units at the start of the combat, so no retreats through a hex vacated by an enemy unit's loss or option. Handle retreats through non-combat units, aircrafts, and ships as you would when moving, right, per 9.14, right? If all of the defenders are destroyed or retreat, attacking units can enter the defender's hex. A. Only those units that paid combat supply costs can advance, including those of the strength of 0. If the attacker take their option as a retreat, no advance is possible, right? Advance after combat can capture or destroy enemy ships, aircraft, and non-combat units per 9.14. Keep that in mind. Right? And advance after combat is required after a successful overrun, but not after regular combat. The owning player gets to choose which of his attacking units advance. Right? Exploit results I'm going to explain when we get to it. Right? Once we get to the exploitation phase. I'm just going to place them down if I get them, but a full explanation will come in the exploitation phase. So I'm just going to briefly go over some specialized combats that we haven't covered before. We have covered supply dumps, transport points, and extenders. So let's just go 9.14a. Combat strength involving units with 0 combat strength requires some special handling. Attacks against 0 combat strength begin on the rightmost column of the table. Attacks with 0 strength must be supplied normally and begin on the leftmost column. If both sides have 0 strength, call it 1-1 and shake your head. So the situations that those are going to come up are quite rare, but that's just how you handle that, right? Just keep that in mind. Next on the list of ones we haven't covered yet, right? Hedgehogs. When an enemy attack unit enters a hex with an enemy hedgehog, it is captured, and I will put some hedgehogs down to show their effects on combat and what happens when they're captured, right? Air bases. When enemy attack capable units enter a hex with an airbase, it is captured. A captured airbase can be used immediately. Alright, now I'm not going to demonstrate that right now. That's going to be more part of the air unit, right? Same with all this. Well, we'll come back to that when it comes to the video on air operations. Same with naval and ports. That will be covered when we start looking at the naval stuff, right? And barrage we will get to at a later point. So what are we going to be doing now? Now I will give some examples of combat. In this case, I will show combat as a result from Overrun, right? And this will be our first combat example. Then I'm going to segue. I'm going to do a few more movement to finish off this example of play's movement. Then I'm going to move into barrage. Well, first things first, I'm going to move into reaction from the enemy, so we're covering reaction. Then I'm going to move into barrage, and then we're going to give a few more play examples of barrage and combat, right, throughout the rest of the video. And then, last but not least, we will look at exploitation, which is what comes after all this, right? So let's start by going through our very first combat example, right? And if you remember, we had these two units right here, just these two, not the ones beneath it, overrunning GAFSA, right? And they've paid the movement allowance, and now it's time for us to go through the sequence summary, right? And again, I'm going to be going through the sequence summary step by step, every combat, so you can see exactly what I'm doing, right? The attacker selects the attacking and defending hexes. This has been done. Right? I'm attacking from the hex I'm overrunning from, and my target is GAFSA. Both players expend the required supply points. Note, if the defender cannot expend supply or chooses not to do so, he defends at half strength. In this case, both sides are going to spend supply. Right? I'm attacking with 2 units, and as we discussed in a previous video, the cost of attack in all attacks in all OCS games is 1T per attacking step. And remember that these 2 units here are a step each. You know, individual units are a step. So I'm attacking with 2 steps. That's going to cost me 2T. Let's create that change here out of this dump, right? I've paid, and now the defender pays. The defender is defending with a regimental equivalent and a half, right? So if you want a bit more of detail on how this stuff works, let's bring up the OCS 4.3 charts, right? Right. I don't normally have this open, but I'm just going to do it so I can zoom in a lot closer for you. Right, OCS 4.3 charts and table, right? And we're going to come to not combat. We are going to start here on page 2, right? Page 2 details combat supply. If you ever need, like, you can get it here from your 4.3 charts, or you can get it from the manual, where well, actually, no, not quite. It doesn't actually say in the manual, so you can actually only really get this information from the OCS 4.3 charts. Now, I haven't really used the 4.3 charts in any particular detail yet in this series, and that's because the 4.3 charts, oh, I have used it for capture, but besides that, the 4.3 charts are mostly here to govern combat, air operations, barrages, etc. So you're going to see it come up a lot more now as we get into these things. But yeah, let's start with this, right? And again, the OCS 4.3 charts has a combat sequence summary. And as a matter of fact, I might follow the combat sequence summary here on the 4.3 charts, because that's more likely where you, a player, whether you're playing on the board or through Vassal, are going to be getting it from. So let's stick with the 4.3 charts from now, right? And both players expend required supply points, right? So the attacker pays 1 T per attacking step. Just bear in mind that there is an exception here for DAG, right? 1 T per attacking step, which has been paid. And the defender always just plays 2 T per combat, with only one exception, right? So keep that in mind, that you could have a huge stack of units there, right? Many regimental equivalents worth. It'll still only cost 2 T, and there's only one exception to that. If it's 1 regimental equivalent or less, the cost is 1 T. Alright? Units can only use internal stocks if on-map supplies are unavailable, and in which case that's not applicable to this situation. So here in GAFSA we've got 1 regiment in the form of this unit, and we've got 1 battalion, so it's 1.5 regimental equivalents, in which case it doesn't apply for this exception, it's just 2 T, and we're going to pay that from GAFSA. Alright? So that's been paid. Let's return now to the combat sequence summary and see what it tells us to do. All right. The attacker identifies his action rating unit, followed by the defender identifying his. Right. Now there's a choice for both sides in this, which I did deliberately. Right. Now keep in mind, right, from what we read in the manual, there's several implications with this selection. Not only are you selecting the unit whose action rating will be the action rating used for combat calculations. Remember, action ratings do not add together like combat strength. You only use one, right? You only select one out of the stack that you're using, right? So not only is that important, but they're going to be the first unit taking the loss. If there is a loss to be taken, they have to be the first unit to take it. So think they're at the tip of the spear in this particular example, right? So be careful when selecting it, but generally speaking, in most combats, it's just common sense to take the unit with the highest action rating. So in this case, I will take this L plus British Armoured Battalion with an action rating of 4. Right, let me zoom in a fair bit closer, so you can see exactly what we're doing here. Right, this unit with an action rating of 4. Right. And the defender is going to select this unit with an action rating of 4, because again, this is just one of those common sense situations where the attacker and the defender both want a high action rating, right? Because again, the unit, whether that be attacker or defender, with the higher action rating is going to be receiving substantial benefits, right? So, now the defender announces terrain choices, and the players determine initial odds. So in this case, the defender is going to look at the hex that he's defending in, and the hex sides, and determine what terrain that this combat is going to occur in, right? And remember that there are multiple options to be made if you're being attacked from many different hexes, but in this case it's only coming from one hex. There's no hex side, there's no river or wadi between these hexes. There is one parallel to them, but that's not relevant. It would have to be between them for it to be relevant. So inside this hex, there's only two terrain types. There's open and there's a village, right? Now, if you are the defender here, and we're just going to pull up the terrain effects chart, right? And we're going to make a bit of an interpretation based on what we know. Open has significant benefits for armor and mechanized units that only apply to the attacker. That would be bad. So as the defender, I'm clearly motivated to say, okay, I'm not going to choose open terrain. And you'll find that 99% of circumstances, the terrain choice is common sense. You want to choose the one that penalizes the attacker more. But I'm just giving a more explicit example here. The village is just a 1x modifier for everybody. Not to mention that it's a different combat line as well. And just as a general explanation to what we read in the manual, open combat line is best for the attacker. Anything that goes beneath that, whether that be close, very close, or extremely close, is going to be worse for the attacker and better for the defender, right? So as the defender, I'm given the choice of what terrain this is going to be occurring with, and I'm going to pick village because that is out of all the options available here, that is the most prohibitively expensive and dangerous for the attacker, right? And then we determine our initial odds, right? Now, I'm just going to go back to the manual for the more explicit explanation on how to do this, because obviously I have my own quicker way of doing it. But, again, it's best to go by the book in this circumstance, right? Let's bring the units back onto the map. And just remember that we're disregarding these two units. They're not part of the combat. However, when there's a defender in a defending hex, you don't get to choose which combat units are a part of that combat, right? Everyone here, these two units have to be a part of the combat. One can't sit it out, right? However, the attacker is only attacking with these two units, right? Now, to determine the raw combat odds, use the total modified attacking strength and total modified defending strength. Divide both by the smaller of them and apply the rounding rule to each result. The express result is a ratio of attacker to defender. Alright. I'm going to bring up my Word document. I'm just going to go to the bottom here to make this super simple. And just make the text really large. Right. And we'll do the math here. Right. Now, it says modified attacking strength and modified defending strength, right? So what it's asking us to do here is to take whatever it's been modified by. This could be many things, not just terrain effects. It could be DG, it could be out of supply, right? But in this case, there's no DG involved here or other mode effects. We're only going to be factoring in terrain, right? And because in our Tunisia thing, the village is ×1 for everyone here, whether that be armor, mech, or other, right? These guys are armor, these guys are other. They have no color coding, they're just other, right? We're just going to take the raw mathematical values and add them together, right? Total modified attacking strength, total modified defending strength, right? Let's pull up a calculator, whether it be your Windows or Mac calculator, or whether it be a physical calculator, right? And we're going to modified attacking strength, right? Now this is simple math, but I'm just doing this for the sake of everybody. 7 plus 7 equals 14. So we have a total combat strength. Let's write this down. 14 attacker, right? And 5 plus 2, come on, I don't even have to put that into the calculator. That's 7, right? 7 defender, right? And that's just, there's no modifiers to this because the terrain does not offer any modifiers, right? Divide both by the smaller of them and apply the rounding rule to each result, right? Now this is usually pretty simple, right? Because it says divide both by the smaller of them. It's just important to understand which one's bigger, because obviously sometimes, depending on your lack of judgment or judgment or lack thereof, you may be attacking with a smaller combat strength than the enemy is defending with, right? There are circumstances where that may be advantageous, right? That's why it's important to divide both by the smaller of them, and in that case, smaller would be the attacker. But in this case, smaller is the defender, right? So let's just divide both real quick, right? So divide both by the smaller of them, right? So what's 14 divided by 7? Pretty simple. That's 2. what's 7 divided by 7? Because remember, we're dividing both the attacker and the defender strength by the smaller of them. The smaller is 7. 7 divided by 7 is 1. And naturally, right, naturally, the smaller divided by the smaller is going to be 1 every time. It doesn't matter if it's 15.6, right, for the defender strength. Divide that by 15.6, you're going to get 1 every time. A number divided by itself is going to be 1 every time, right? But for the sake of procedure, this is what it tells you to do. But if you want to make this a bit more intuitive, take the whoever's got the larger combat strength, whether that be defender or attacker, divide that by the smaller, right, 14 divided by 7 in this case, 2, and then just that as a ratio to 1, right? Right? Express this result as a ratio of attacker to defender, right? The only reason this could be, let's say this was different, right? Let's say that I was attacking with 7 and the enemy was defending with 14, right? We would round both by the smaller of them. We would still get 2 and 1, but in this case, right, the ratio would be, attack. So let me give you an example, right? Attacker is 7, defender is 14. Divide both by the smaller of them, right? So we're going to divide attacker by the smaller of them, which is attacker, 1, and defender by the smaller of them, which is 2. And that is, it's always expressed as a ratio of attacker to defender. So in this case, where I'm the attacker with 14 and the defender is 7, it's 2 to 1. But in the case of if it was opposite, it would be 1 to 2. And how that's relevant, you'll see very soon. And believe me, I know this is confusing at first glance, but I will do many different combats, and I will calculate it each time so you can see exactly what I'm doing, right? But in any case, right, we can say here that it's 14 defender, attacker, 14 defender. The ratio is 2 to 1, right? Right? And so what is the charts telling us to do? Determine initial odds, right? We need to actually find this, right? The combat table has a row for each terrain category. Find the odds determined by the correct row. Use the terrain and the defender's hex. Use the highest column that is less than or equal to the determined rounded odds. Now look, I can't get too close into what less than or equal to really means in this example because it's not fractional, but you'll at least get an idea of what it's talking about, right? So let's go to the table. We have to zoom out a little bit here, and we have to go to this combat table, right? This combat table governs all combat units fighting combat units, and it will give you your result based on your calculations, right? And so we are in close terrain. Notice here that the first thing you're going to see in the top left of the combat table is a set of columns: open, close, very close, extremely close, right? And that will correspond directly with the combat line on the terrain effects chart on any game that you're playing, right? Open, close, very close, and then there'll be extremely close, and then you've got open, close, very close, and extremely close. So what you need to do is you need to find the terrain that you're fighting in as determined by the defender, which in this case is a village, right? Which is close terrain. So you need to find that, and then you need to find your ratio, right? In this case, our ratio is 2 to 1, right? Now, there is obviously a procedure for if your ratio is a fraction, whether like if it's 2.4 or 2.5 or 2.6, and what that means, especially because as you go further along here, you'll notice that it's not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 15, 18. It's not consecutive digits. It goes up, right? And so when you're dealing with fractions, that becomes important. But I can only really show that in other combats, which we will get to later in the video. So for now, all you need to know is that we're in close terrain because it's a village, and we're finding our combat odds, which is 2 to 1. All right. Let's go back to the procedure here, right? Because now we have found our initial odds. We found it. We found our odds. Sorry, these are rows. I accidentally called them columns before, but we found the row, the close terrain row, and we found our column, our initial odds column. This is the column, right? Notice that your odds have to be different to get into this column depending on whether you're in open, very close, or extremely close, right? So, what is it asking us to do now? Announce action rating values, attacker first, then defender, right? So, again, just I announce I've got a 4. As the defender, I announce I have a 4, right? And then so once you have that, right? See, this is why the manual's also important, because the manual's a bit more explicit about this, right? It says use each side's action rating unit to determine the DRM, right? So that the 4.3 chance isn't entirely clear about this, but you can use the sequence summary here in the manual to be a bit more clear about it. And that is to say, take a look at your action rating and take a look at your opponent's, find the difference, and then you have the you have the DRM. And remember, that can be positive or negative, it can be, in your favor or against you, right? But in this case, I've got a 4, the enemy has a 4, that's 0. There's 0 difference between 4 and 4. There's no difference between those numbers. So the DRM is 0. Now the next step is to roll 2 dice to determine surprise, and you modify it per 9.8, right? And remember, 9.8 in this case is talking about adding the DRM, in which case it's 0, but we'll show adding the DRM where it's not 0 in a later combat, right? And then subtract 1 if it's in a hedgehog, but there's no hedgehog in this circumstance, but we will show that later, right? So for now, all we're doing is just a surprise roll, and we're going to take a look at what the result of that surprise roll is, right? Where do you see the numbers for this? Down here at the bottom of the combat table, right? So as you can see here, the numerics of it are a bit different depending on overrun or regular, right? So make sure you use the one that is for your specific type of attack, and in this case we're doing an overrun. So here are the odds. If it's a 9 or more, it's attacker surprise. 6 or less, it's defender surprise. I don't know what it's going to be. For the sake of having fun in this tutorial, let's roll the dice and find out, right? I'm the attacker. I'm rolling a 9. Remember, the attacker always does the surprise roll. I've rolled a 9, and that is attacker surprise, right? What happens if the attacker wins surprise? What happens when anyone wins surprise, right? If surprise occurs, roll 1 die and shift the final odds column on the combat table that number of columns. Thieves shifts it to the right for the attacker surprise and left for defender surprise. So we're going to the right because this is attacker surprise, right? Let's do it, right? Let's do it. So here we are, we're at 2 to 1 in close terrain, right? We're here. And we're going to roll 1 dice. Woo, that's a 6. That's a 6. That's the highest possible 1 dice roll you can get. And what happens here is you shift that many columns in your favors. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So my ratio of combat strength has just jumped from 2 to 1 to 12 to 1. So basically by a factor of 6. That's the power of surprise, right? And we can take a look at the difference in the combat result if I had or hadn't won surprise based on this, right? But now we've resolved surprise. So what does the procedure tell us to do after that, right? All right, because we're currently just past step 6. Roll 2 dice to determine any surprise. Modify odds per 9.8. Right? We rolled 2 dice. 1 player, 1 surprise. We roll 1 dice. We shift that many columns in their favor. Right? Step 7. Roll 2 dice and use the DRM in 9.6 to determine the result. So this is where we actually find out what the result of the combat is, right? So keep in mind we are here in the 12 to 1 column, and you're going to roll 2 dice and you're going to add the DRM. In this case, the DRM is 0. So we're only just going to be doing a basic 2 dice roll and finding out as we go further, 1 or less, all the way up down to here, we're going to find out what our result is, right? A 6. Cool. 12 to 1, 1, 2, the numbers are over here by the way, right, if you need to count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Right. We have an A01, defender lose 1, O1. Great. Great. Right. Because for the sake of what the allied player is trying to achieve here, this is a very interesting result. Right. With several strategic implications. Or tactical implications, I guess one might more aptly say. Right. Attack, so in this case, like we read before, A, so the digits on this, right, we're going to zoom close in on this, everything here has a meaning. A means attacker, D means defender, right, we can get that out of the way, it's pretty simple. O means option, L means loss, right, we read that in the manual, right, but now we're going to get a bit more of a hands-on demonstration of what this actually means, right. Now, first things first to remember with this stuff, attacker always executes their result first. You can't wait for the defender to do it and then have the attacker do it. Attacker always does it first. And this is especially important because what the attacker does with their result in this circumstance, with them having an option, will affect what the defender will or won't have to do, right? And the reason this is because if we go down to results and options, right? The very important 9.10c, the defender gets to ignore his options if the attacker has retreated or cannot take all of his options, but the defender can still choose to apply if he wants to retreat. The attacker must always fulfill his option results. So let's take a look here, right? What is an option? Because I'm going through the attackers first. An option result can be taken as any combination of step losses and retreat, provided the total number is fully executed. For instance, a loss of 1 step combined with a retreat of 1 hex satisfies an O2 result. What do I have here? I have an A01. Right? Functionally, what this means is that these two units either need to retreat 1 hex or they need to kill 1 unit. Besides the obvious, what's the difference between those two choices? Especially in the context that this is an overrun, right? So this is an overrun, which means that they are attacking into GAFSA. If they retreat, then they cannot take GAFSA. Remember that retreating, when you're overrunning with units, retreating a hex ends their movement. That's it. It's done. They're not moving any further, right? Furthermore, if I retreat, just like we said before, that nullifies the defender's option, right? Which means that although the defender has an L1, they need to kill a unit, they will not have to take their option, meaning the remaining unit can continue to occupy GAFSA. So for the sake of demonstration, I'm going to, as the allied player, I'm going to take a decision to kill this action rating unit. Bear in mind, it's the action rating unit that has to die first. I can't kill this lower action rating unit as a way of saving this higher action rating unit. The first loss, and the first and only the first loss, has to come from the action rating unit. So I'm going to right click, I'm going to send them to the dead pile. So I've just taken a step loss, right? Now, I've executed my result as the attacker. It's now the defender's turn, right? The defender has a DL101, and he has to execute his option because the attacker did not retreat. Again, if the attacker retreated, this O1 would be made voluntary, not mandatory, so you can ignore it. But in this case, the attacker did take the kill. He did kill one of his own units to satisfy the option, so the defender is applicable for the whole DL01 result. So what's the defender going to do? Well, he has no choice in the case of the loss. He has to lose a unit, and just like we said, the action rating unit has to die first, right? So off to the dead pile with this infantry regiment, right? Now there's an option. This march battalion either has to retreat or die. Now, there's a few different options here, right? Dying is one option, but it makes no sense, right? Because then the one way or the other, the enemy is advancing into GAFSA, right? And as the defender, do you want a dead unit? Do you want another dead unit? Or do you at least want this unit to live another day and retreat, right? In this case, it's common sense to want to retreat and preserve the unit, right? But there's some issues here. First and foremost is the enemy has a zone of control here, which will result in a negative consequence. Remember, retreating through an enemy zone of control results in a DG, and if he was already DG'd, he would die if he retreated into that zone of control, right? And negation has no impact on that, so it wouldn't even matter. I'm just going to move this over here because it's not a combat unit. It wouldn't even matter if there was a friendly unit here covering the zone of control. The ZOC would still have that negative effect. So realistically, the only places that you could successfully retreat within the bounds of the rules is here and here, right? It's usually not acceptable to retreat adjacent to the enemy, right? But again, there are situations where that becomes permissible under certain agreed upon circumstances. Again, bending the definition of what's locally to the rear. But in this case, yeah, it's only really possible to retreat here or here, right? I just want to remind players of that, right? In terms of directions, right? Retreats, yeah, direction. Players can retreat their own units. Retreating units can be as a stack or split up. A retreat should be away from enemy units involved in the combat, but to avoid losses, retreating units are allowed to bend the definition of what's locally to the rear. Now, there's no way to avoid losses by retreating here, so in most players' interpretation of the rules, it's not legal to retreat here. It wouldn't be away from the attacking units. So you can only retreat here, here, or here, and retreating here would result in the unit becoming disorganized, because it would involve retreating into an enemy zone of control. However, I don't want to leave this road open for the enemy to simply just advance and attack the German reserves. So I will retreat here, but I will become DG because I'm retreating into a zone of control. So I'll apply that DG. Alright? Now, advancing after combat. Right? Let's go back to the procedure. Let's go back to the procedure to make sure that we're not getting too far away from that, right? Execute combat results, attacker first, then defender, starting with a unit of each side used to determine the action rating unit. Yes. Right? If the defender's hex is now vacant and the attacker has not retreated as part of an option result, and they have not, the attacker did not retreat, the attacker can advance after combat into the defender's hex. One more note on this, if it's an overrun, there is no a choice of advancing. If you can advance, you have to advance. That's another difference with an overrun. You have to advance with an overrun if you succeed in the combat, right? So we're going to advance into GAFSA, and as we've discussed in a previous supply video, there's a supply capture that needs to be taken care of here. We're going to do that now. I'm not going to get into the in-depths of how that works because we've already covered it in a previous video. I'm just going to roll on the dump on the ground. Roll one dice. It's a 4, 50%. I capture 1T for the allies, right? And GAFSA has been captured, and that combat is concluded. Right. And so now, I'm not going to do any further overruns with the allies. I'm going to move around a few more units, and then we're going to proceed to the reaction of the Germans, so then we can cover what reaction is and its place in an OCS turn. So let's move some more units around here. Let's pay for his fuel and put him there, and we can just put him there. Yep, put that over there. And what else? Let's see. Yep, I think that should be fine. All right. We'll leave it at that, right? So in the course of a turn narrative sequence of play, we would now say that the movement phase is over. I'm not involving aircraft in this whatsoever, right? Because they're not really part of the tutorial yet. They really need their own whole video. So just for the imaginary purposes, we're going to say that aircraft are not involved in this whole series of operations here, right? So we're skipping air barrages. For the sake of supply, I'm not going to get into trace supply or supply checks right now. Because it's not, we've covered it in a previous video. So let's just say, for the sake of this procedure, we've done our supply check on both, on the allied player, and the allied player's units are in trace supply, right? So let's return now to our coveted narrative sequence of play, or the OCS turn summary, find out where we stand, right? Because so far within the tutorial we have covered up until here, the supply. But now we're going to look at reaction. And remember the colors change here, right? So now the actual the non-phasing player now becomes the person who's actually going to start moving units, aka your opponent, right? So let's give reaction a quick read here. Release reserves, which can then move at half of their movement allowance. They can overrun, expend fuel as needed, blow dumps, air units can perform missions, exploitation cannot be earned during those overruns, right? Let's read a little bit more from the manual about what the reaction phase is. Now, I just want to keep in mind that there is a reaction phase in every turn, right? And it is always performed by the player who is the opponent, like it played by the other player, the non-phasing player in that turn, right? What you can and can't do is going to be limited to however many reserve markers you have and whatever game you're playing and whatever the situation is, but it occurs every turn, right? It is the next in the series of phases, right? So let's take a look and see what the OCS manual says explicitly about the reaction phase, right? 7.0 reaction phase. The reaction phase is a chance for the non-phasing player to disrupt enemy plans with movement, overruns, and barrages. There is no combat segment, right? So we're not going to be talking too much about combat in this context, although keep in mind that you can overrun, which means you can do some form of combat in reaction, right? The only ground units that can be used in this phase are non-phasing players' released reserve mode units, right? And there is an exception to this that ground units can use air transport, but we're going to save that for the air video. He can release as many or as few reserves as he wants. See 5.7b for complete details. Released artillery can conduct barrages in the phase's barrage segment, right? And that has to be artillery that was in reserve, right? Handle barrages and overruns in the reaction phase normally, right? The non-phasing player's ships and active aircraft are also eligible to be used in this phase, right? However, we're not going to be getting into that. We're not going to be getting into aircraft and ships right now, but just bear in mind that they are eligible for use in the reaction phase when we get up to that, right? So that's a basic reading of what the reaction phase is, right? And you can see back again that the reaction phase is split into two segments, movement and barrage, and in the movement you release reserves. So as you can see here in this play demonstration, we'll get started with the play demonstration. The Axis player has 2 units here in reserve that he has allocated during his turn. Remember, it is during your turn that you place units in reserve for whatever your purposes may be. Right? Now keep in mind that reserve is not just for reaction, it is also for exploitation, which we'll be demonstrating later in this video. Right? So here we have some elements of the 15th Panzer Division in reserve. Right? We have a armored recon unit, and we have a artillery unit. Right? So now let's just say it's the reaction for the Germans, and they're going to release these guys from reserve, and they're going to conduct some operations with them, right? Bear in mind that units released in reserve from a reserve marker in the reaction phase have half of their movement allowance. So this 8 is 4 and this 3 is 1.5. And for the sake of movement, they still require fuel, right? All this is detailed pretty well in the turn summary, so you can appreciate that, right? So what are we going to do, right? What am I going to do as a German player? I want to use this opportunity to disrupt enemy operations, right? I want to counterattack. I want to stop the enemy from pulling off something that I would not be happy to receive, right? And as the defending German player, I have a feeling that these units are going to be attacked by my opponent with his American units. So I want to disturb that, and I'm going to disturb it by conducting an overrun and a barrage, right? And we're going to go ahead with that now, right? So for starters, we're going to pay 1T for the fuel of this one unit, right? And remember, he only has 4 movement allowance because it's halved in reaction. So he's going to move here for 1 along the secondary road, and then he's going to spend 3 movement points and overrun this unit here, which he can do because it's in open terrain with nothing in between them, right? And he still has 3 movement points left, so he's going to overrun this enemy unit, right? And let's just go through the procedure again, alright? Although this is an example of reaction, I'm just going to go through the sequence summary. I'm going to go through it a bit quicker than last time, right? But there is a few new examples here relevant to combat that you're going to want to see, alright? Let's jump into it. Let's 340, let's say. Alright, here we go. Alright. So, first things first, the attacker selects attacking and defending hexes, which I have done as the attacker, as the Germans, right? Both play... Just before we get into anything, remember, this is not the German player's official turn. This is his reaction, right? But the German player is the attacker, because he is overrunning in his reaction, right? Both players expend the required supply. So in this case, the Axis player will spend 1T per attacking step from the HQ, who throws it to this unit per the supply rules that we discussed in the previous video. And just for the sake of it, let's just use this 1T in GAFSA, right? Why is it 1T only for the defender? Remember, right? Remember from the charts here, combat supply. If it's 1 regimental equivalent or less, the cost is 1T. A BG is 1 regimental equivalent, right? In the context of Tunisia, right? So we're just going to use that 1T over here that he is adjacent to, and that will pay for that. All right. Let's go further through the procedure here. Announce action rating values, attack first, then defender. This is a lot easier this time around because there's only 1 unit each on each side of this combat, right? So obviously mine will be 5 and the enemy's will be 2, right? The defender announces terrain choices and the players then determine initial odds. Alright, cool. So as you can see here, there isn't much of a terrain choice available to the defender. It's just open. There's nothing between them. Again, there's a parallel, but not between. Alright, the mountains are over here. But between these 2 hexes, it's just straight open terrain. Alright? So what that leaves left to do is to determine the initial odds. So let's take a look at the terrain type that we're dealing with here, right? Because this is where it's going to get interesting. It's open, right? And that's 2 times for mech. And this guy's mechanized. But this guy's mechanized too. So let's talk about anti-tank, right? That confusing notion that came up before that we didn't really know how to understand properly. Well, now I can give you an example, right? AT, where is that? It's down here, isn't it? Yep. Right. A 2 times terrain effect when attacking armor or mech is sometimes brought down to 1.5. Do this when attacking hex has same or higher level of AT effects. Same or higher. So is it 1.5? Is it same or higher? Let's find out. He has light AT, and he has light AT. Red-coded units that don't have a tank symbol. This is not a tank symbol. I know it might seem like it, but if you actually go to the top of the manual, so yeah, that's a tank symbol. That's an armored infantry symbol. As far as I know, armored infantry does not count as tanks. Feel free to correct me if you run OCS, right? But as far as I know, that's still mechanized, right? So both of these units have light AT. Now, same or higher level of AT turns a 2 into a 1.5. And so that's what we're dealing with here, right? In the case of Tunisia 2, the 2 times becomes 1.5. Now, who knows what 4 times 1.5 is, right? Well, I know that's 6, right? But I'll just prove it to you. 4 times 1.5. It's 6, right? Now, there's no other terrain effects here, so I've got 6 and the defender's got 6. So 6, 6, what's that ratio? Do you really have to do the math on that? Well, let's do it anyway, right? Remember, divide each by the smaller of them. 6 divided by 6, and then 6 divided by 6, 1. Ratio, 1 to 1 in open terrain, right? Hope that I'm not going to needlessly complicate this. This is one of the most simple examples of odds calculations. Let's go to our 4.3 chart, and we can see that our initial column here is 1 to 1 in open terrain. You might find it interesting that this is the same column we started before in the last combat, because 1 to 1 in open terrain is equivalent to 2 to 1 in closed terrain, right? So we've got 1 to 1 in open terrain, right? And now, as per the sequence, we're going to use each side's action rating unit and determine the DRM, right? Remember, that's attacker minus defender. 5 minus defender, 2. What's that? What's 5 minus 2? Look it on the fingers here, right? 5 minus 2 is 3, right? So we have a DRM of 3, plus 3, not minus 3, plus 3, right? Roll 2 dice to determine surprise. Modify the odds column per 9.8. So again, we're still using the overrun attack stats here because this is an overrun. Now, 9 or more is attack surprise, 6 or less is defender surprise, but bear in mind this time we have a DRM of plus 3. We're going to add that to our 2 dice roll. So let's roll 2 dice for surprise. This is already attacker surprise, right, because it's a 9. But in reality, you add the DRM to that too. So it's 5 plus 4, 9, and then plus 3, which is the DRM. 9 plus 3 is 12, right? So even if we had rolled lower, even if we had rolled a 6, this still would have been attacker surprise, right? Now we roll 1 dice to determine the shifts. The DRM does not affect this 1 dice roll. It's just a single 1 dice roll, and you take it as it is. So we're starting in the 1 to 1 in open terrain. We're going to roll 1 dice. It's a 3. So we go from 1 to 1 to 2 to 1. So 1, 2, 3, right? You count starting from here, 1, 2, 3, 4 to 1, right? So we've gone up by a factor of 4, right? 4 to 1 in open terrain is now the adjusted column. Now what do we do? Right? We roll 2 dice and we do add the DRM, and that will determine our result. So we're going to roll 2 dice here in this column. We're going to add 3. Remember, 3 is our DRM, and that will be our combat result. Let's hope for some success here, right? As you can see, before I roll, as you can see, the combat strength is not a great ratio here, right? I'm leveraging the action rating in the hope that it will give me a better result. Roll 2 dice. Oof. We've rolled a 3. And then we add 3 onto that for the DRM. We've rolled a 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Ooh. So now we have an attacker option 1, defender option 1. One of those very annoying results for an attacker to receive. What does this mean? Same as before. As the attacker, I either have to die or retreat to execute this, right? And if I retreat, the defender doesn't have to do anything at all. Now I'm looking at this and I'm going, damn. Well, this German unit is quite valuable. It's got a 5 action rating. That's valuable in and of itself. And the unit that I'm trying to kill is not worth dying over. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go, right, I will retreat, right? What are my retreat options? I'm the attacker and I'm retreating, right? I'm going to satisfy this AO1 with a retreat. Where can I retreat? Can I retreat here? No. Mountains are prohibited. Can I retreat here? No. Mountains are prohibited. Can I retreat here? Technically, yes. It's away from the enemy that I'm engaging in combat with. However, I will become disorganized, because I'll be retreating into a hex with an enemy zone of control. Whether that's disadvantageous to me or not, it's difficult to say right now. Can I retreat here? Good question, right? Saltmarsh in Tunisia 2 is prohibited. However, can retreats take use of roads? Who knows the answer to this question? Because I don't, I forgot. Right? When you retreat... Okay, so after a brief pause there to actually check the rules, I may be corrected if I'm wrong, but from everything that I understand, yes, you can retreat along a road. It's not the same as an overrun. So it is... So while this unit cannot retreat here or here, he is allowed to retreat here or here. Right? If I'm wrong, feel free for someone to come out and correct me, but I'm fairly sure that for the purposes of retreats, roads are allowed to be used. So in this case, I'm going to retreat here, and I'll be retreating along the road, even though the salt marsh is prohibited. And in this case, because it is a DO1, the defender does not need to do anything. And so as the defender, I choose not to do anything. I'm going to stay in place. Right? Now, continuing this reaction, I will take this artillery and I will put it here. And that will end the movement segment of the reaction. But now we will get into barrage. Alright? Because I'm going to conduct an artillery barrage with this unit. And that requires us to get into the reading of barrage. So that we're effectively done with what reaction is. I mean, just keep in mind a few other things about reaction. You can blow up your supply. You can conduct air operations. Those things are not yet covered. And they will be covered again in further examples of play. But for now, just keep in mind that the bread and butter of what you're going to be doing in your reaction is reacting with reserve mark units, and that's what we're doing right now. Next up with artillery. So let's get into artillery, or barrage with artillery. For that, we need to start with barrage. All right. Now, we're going to be reading up to... We're going to be skipping barrage versus facility because that is primarily done with aircraft, although it can still be done with artillery. So we're going to read barrage up until here, and here, and here, and artillery, but we will leave out air and naval to their own respective videos. So, let's begin with the reading. Barrage. Artillery ships and aircraft use barrages to attack enemy units and facilities. Use the barrage table appropriate for the target. Although more than one unit can attack in the same barrage, only units of the same general type, artillery, naval, or air, can combine in a single barrage. Barrages occur in the barrage segments of the movement, reaction, and combat exploitation phases. If besides air units are allowed to perform hip shoots, these barrages are made during movement segments of those phases. That's something we'll get into later. Any number of artillery units and/or ships, up to 4 aircraft, can participate in a single barrage. The following general procedure is used in all types of barrages, air, artillery, and naval, and when using either type of the barrage tables. Total the barrage strengths for firing, determining the correct column on the supply table. Expend supply for the amount listed on that column for firing artillery only, and adjust the column per the table's notes. Roll 2 dice and apply the result. Important note, it takes at least 1 point to get on the table before shifts are applied. 0-point barrages are not allowed. Use the barrage table to conduct barrages against enemy combat units. The primary goal is to DG them. The targeted player picks the terrain to be used for possible shifts. He also selects which combat units in the stack absorb any resulting step losses. Note, a single division, even a multi-unit formation, never counts for more than 3 regimental equivalents for potential density shifts. Use the actual amount if less than 3 RE. Right. That's something that will come up in a demonstration, which I'll use Smolensk for. Right. In this video, we're going to use Smolensk for some combat examples with step losses and some barrage examples for stacking purposes. Right. Spotter restrictions. A correct spotter for a barrage is any friendly combat unit adjacent to the target hex that is not loaded on a landing craft. Right. So generally any combat unit adjacent. Right. Barrage table attacks made without a correct spotter penalize 3-column shift. Hip shoots cannot be made unless they have a correct spotter, and spotting does not affect the barrage versus facility table aside from the hip shoot restriction. Right. Now we're not going to get into barrage versus facility, that's more of an air thing, although you can do it with artillery. We're focusing on barrage and combat units for now. Alright. 10.D, barraging mixed target hexes. Hexes will often contain targets that are affected in different ways by different barrage tables. As such, in any barrage, the attacking player must announce a general target, such as combat units or port, and apply the barrage points to that target only. An example would be a hex containing combat units, an airbase, and a port. The player can use a barrage table to attack the combat units, or the barrage versus facility table to attack either the port or the airbase, but not all at once. Alright. Barrage limits and phasing. Several restrictions are placed on the conduct of barrages by certain units in certain phases. Regardless of how many different types of targets are in a hex, only one barrage per hex is allowed in each phase, and the only exceptions to this are anti-ship barrages and hip shoots. Note, a declared mission that is completely destroyed or aborted by flak or interception does count against this limit. Now that's more of an air thing, again. A unit can only barrage once per phase and cannot split its strength between several barrages or fire less than its printed strength. However, there is an optional rule that most people use to circumvent this, just keep that in mind. Only air and naval barrages can be performed during the movement phase, mainly during its barrage segment. The exceptions are hip shoots, which occur during the movement segment. Only artillery can barrage during the combat phase. All types, air, naval, and artillery, can barrage during reaction and exploitation phases. A barrage can only use a single type of barraging unit, either air, naval, artillery. They can't combine together. Now, artillery barrages, that's what we're about to do. Right? Artillery barrages ranges are given in hexes. These are unaffected by weather and terrain. An artillery unit with a range of 3 can barrage targets from 1 to 3 hexes away. Supply cost. Expend combat supply to conduct an artillery barrage at the moment of the barrage. The cost is given near the top of the appropriate table. Use the cost of the barrage's initial column before any shifts. If SP is required to fire, the barrage is unavailable. Do not execute the barrage. There is no penalty. The units selected for a cancelled barrage are not considered to have fired. Right? A. Supply for a multi-unit barrage must come from the same HQ, or from the same dump if no HQ is used. Right? Artillery units still use their full barrage strength when marked out of supply. C. Barrage can never be made using internal stocks, right? So internal stocks regarding artillery as combat units only relates to combat. There is an example here, but I will now give some examples. So let's do some demonstrations of artillery, right? And then later, after this demonstration, we will do some demonstrations of artillery and combat together in various contexts. So, we are going to target this guy, because he, no, you know what, we're going to target this guy, right? He has the higher action rating. He is the more valuable target, right? He is spotted by these friendly units here. Let's go ahead and get this done. So for what we're doing now, we're going to have to return to the 4.3 charts, and we're going to go to the barrage table, right? Now there's 2 barrage tables here. There's this one, and there's this one. This is the barrage versus facility table. We're not using that right now. That's going to come up a lot more when we talk about aircraft barrages. For now, we're using the barrage table, which governs barrage results against combat units being attacked by artillery, right? So, we have this unit here, and we want to target this unit, right? There isn't an explicit procedure to this. It's pretty much just a pay-and-go system, right? So first thing you want to do is identify your column based on your barrage strength. Now keep in mind this barrage strength can be affected by DG, right? But for now we've got a combat strength of 13, so we are in the 12 to 16 strength column. And this barrage, in that case, will cost 3T. There can be shifts making the barrage stronger or weaker, but you pay before these shifts. So we're going to pay 3T. Bear in mind, aircraft barrages do not have an inherent cost like this. This is artillery only, right? And for now, we're only discussing artillery. Now, I'm kind of running a little low on supply right here, so I'm just going to magically replenish this for the sake of this tutorial. And then I'm going to spend 3T thrown by this HQ to the artillery. Remember, it has to come from the same dump or the same HQ, right? And now my target is this hex. So now that it's been paid, we're starting in this column. But before we roll our dice, we have to determine our shifts. First set of shifts that you have to determine are density shifts, right? So that's calculated by looking at the amount of regimental equivalents in a hex. Let's zoom in a little bit here. Let's go. Right. Here we have a single battalion, and that's it, which is one regimental, which falls into the one regimental equivalent or less, which means we're going to have to shift to the left. So we're going from 12 to 16 to 8 to 11, and I'm sure you can already vaguely tell that that is lowering our chances of a good result, right? Now let's take a look at these additional shifts, right? So you just check this list, and if you apply for any of them, you just take this modifier to your columns, right? And remember, when it comes to density shifts, only combat units apply, transfer points, supply points do not apply, and no multi-step formation or multi-unit formation ever counts for more than 3 regimental equivalents for this purpose. I will give demonstrations of that later. Right? But for now, is there a hedgehog? No, so we're going to ignore that shift. Is it close or very close terrain? No, so we're going to ignore that shift. Is it extremely close terrain? No, so we're going to ignore that shift. Is there a spotter? Yes, he's right here. So we're not going to have a penalty for that, for not having a spotter. Is the target in strat mode? No, so we're not going to be able to take advantage of that. Is it... Okay, this one says aircraft, so obviously we can ignore that. It doesn't apply to artillery barrages, as does this one. It concerns aircraft only, so we're going to ignore these last two as they concern only aircraft. So for now, there's only one shift to the left for density, as mentioned before. So we go from 12 to 16 to 8 to 11, and from here you simply roll 2 dice as follows, right? And the 8 to 11, a roll of 7, as you count from here, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, is a DG. What do these results mean? I can give you a brief explanation, right? A dash is no effect, right? A number is you lose that number of steps and become disorganized, you know, so you basically get killed and DG, which is a pretty brutal result. DG just means that all combat units in the hex are now DG'd, which is the result that we got. A half or parenthesized halved, in basic terms, is a 50-50 chance of a loss. Roll 1 die, on a 4 to 6, a step dies, and the whole stack becomes DG. Normally, under the normal rule set, the defender selects which step dies, and then the rest become DG. The only difference between that and a parenthesized half is if it's in a level 3 or 4 hedgehog, if it's an air or ship barrage, or there's no correct spotter, you treat it as just a DG. Otherwise, you check for half. Right? You check for a half result. Right? In this case, we just score a DG. So I'm going to right click, I'm going to click modes, I'm going to click DG, and the enemy is now DG'd, right? Which is halved his combat strength, and it has brought his action rating down by 1, which thankfully reduces the risk that they pose to my friendly stack should the enemy decide to attack with them, right? So that is a basic demonstration of artillery. But I will give another demonstration now, right? So let's say as part of this demonstration, the reaction for the enemy is now over, and it is now the combat phase for the allied player. Here we have it, right? And as you can see, the combat phase has 2 segments, artillery and combat. So let's use this opportunity to give another example of an artillery strike, right? We're going to use this 1st Armored Division's artillery to barrage this unit here. Now, one thing I didn't point out before that I should have is the range, right? Remember, the bottom number is the range of the artillery. That's how I could attack this hex, because it's 1, 2, it's within its range. Same with this, 1, 2, 3 is within the 3 hex range of this artillery. Just keep that in mind, right? So now I'm going to barrage this. Again, I'm just going to magically replenish this, right, just for the sake of demonstration. Bear in mind that all barrages have to be paid for, right? And we're going to do this barrage, right, because it's now the allied player's combat phase, right? And keep in mind, in the combat phase, all barrages must occur first. You can't barrage and then combat, barrage and then combat, no. You have to do all of your artillery and then you do your combat. That's two separate segments. They have to be followed in that order, right? So, artillery first. We're going to strike this hex. It's 18 combat strength, so let's see where that costs us, right? So I'm going to use, I'll use this, right? 17 to 24 is where that sits. It's going to cost 3T. So we're going to pay for that by drawing back to that dump, right? And this will be our target, right? So the only thing left to do is to look at the shifts, right? That's one regimental equivalent in that hex, so we already know that we're going to set for one left for 1 RE or less. Now keep in mind that this penalty goes both ways. If it's stacked up with lots of regimental equivalents, you'll get a benefit as the barraging player, right? Let's look at the rest of these shifts. Is there a hedgehog? No. Is it in close or very close terrain? Yes, so that's another shift to the left. Extremely close? No. Correct spotter? Yes, so there's no penalty. Strat mode? No, so there's no benefit. And again, we're going to ignore these last two because it concerns aircraft. So total number of shifts is 2 to the left. So we go from 17 to 24 to 12 to 16 to 8 to 11, the column that we were occupying before. Now once again, we just roll 2 dice. And this time we've rolled a 7 again. What luck, right? So this time again we are going to get a DG, right? And that concludes our demonstration specifically of how artillery barrages work. And so now I'm going to enter the part of the video where I'm going to give a large number of examples of combat and artillery. So starting with finishing off this play example with 2 combats, or perhaps just 1 combat for now. Oh, tell you what, we'll have this armored division unit attack this guy, and we will have this unit out of GAFSA attacking this stack, and we'll see how it goes, right? Let's start over here, right? And this should be quite interesting because there's a few different rules that I can demonstrate here. So let's zoom in a little bit more. Alright, cool. Alright. So this unit is going to attack this unit in a regular combat. Keep in mind that if this was an overrun, he couldn't do it. The ABBA rule would prevent it, and we discussed that earlier in the video. But in this case, there was a road connecting the 2 hexes. And okay. Sorry, quick cut there because I needed to make sure I was giving you the correct information. So just note that if a hex can be entered in movement but only using a road, a regular combat is allowed but not an overrun, right? So by attacking this hex, it's legal in the combat phase only, but not for an overrun, right? So let's get back into calculating what's happening here. So again, just to be quite procedural about it, let's go by the sequence summary. Step 1 is finished. Step 2, expending supply. Oh, this is the fun part. Because I believe this guy's been cut off from supply. Attacker has to pay, which he has, right? But what is the defender going to do? Can the HQ throw to him? Let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Well, no, it's already blocked by zone of control, but even if it wasn't, 7, 8, 9. Interesting. So the DAC HQ could have thrown him combat supply if this unit wasn't here, exerting a zone of control and thus blocking the supply path. So what we have to do here is go to low stocks, which is something that we discussed in the previous video, the consequences of such. But for the sake of this combat, he is now supplied. Action rating values 3, and he has a modified 3 because he's a 4 with a DG. DG is -1 to the action rating. Alright. Defender announces terrain choices. Well, as the German defender, he would be picking the rough terrain, right? And they're going to determine the initial odds. So an unmodified 6 and a 5 is halved for the DG. The 5 combat strength becomes 2.5. And let's take a look at the terrain effects here for Tunisia. Right? Rough is half for armor and mech on the attack. and times 1 for everything else. So he's just going to be 2.5, right? Because he's halved for the DG, but there's no terrain effects for him. However, the attacking tanks will be halved as well, because the rough is a half modifier. So he becomes 3, and he becomes 2.5. Let's determine the initial odds, right? I'll show you the quick maths of it, right? 3 divided by 2.5 is 1.2, and 2.5 divided by 2.5 is 1. So it's 1.2 to 1, and in this case we're going to round 1.2 to the nearest fraction. 1.2 to the nearest full number is 1. So it's 1 to 1, and rough terrain in this circumstance is close. So it's going to be 1 to 1 in close terrain with a dice roll modifier of equal, because he is 3 modified by the GG and he is 3, right? You might find through experience that this is actually quite a bad situation for the attacker to be in, but we'll see how it plays out. Maybe he'll be lucky, right? Let's go to the chart, right? Because we're going to just continue following here. We've determined the DRM, which is equal, right? We're going to roll 2 dice to determine surprise. Now look, this is a regular attack. So in this case, the stats are a little bit different. It has to be 10 or more for attack surprise, 5 or less for defender surprise. Let's find out. Smack bang 8 in the middle. Nobody gets surprise, which is bad for the attacker, right? Because 1 to 1 in close terrain is not a good place to be, right? Generally speaking, if you're the attacker, you want to be down here in the bottom right corner of the table. If you're the defender, you want the result to be ending up here in the top left, right? And as you can see, 1 to 1 in close terrain is dangerously close to that left-hand side that you don't want to be at as the attacker. But let's continue to follow here. Roll 2 dice, use the DRM to determine the result. Again, the DRM here is 0, so we're just going to roll 2 dice and get our combat result. Woo! Surprisingly high. So that's an 11. 11 in 1 to 1 in close terrain. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. AO1, DO1. What do I want to do here? Good question. As an ally player, I believe that this tank unit is quite valuable, so I'm going to retreat, and the Axis defender doesn't have to do anything, and that is the combat result there. Alright, now, as the allied player, do I wish to conduct any more combat? Good question. Sometimes you actually have to think about these things. See, as you can see, an equal DRM and a relatively equal combat strength is not a good recipe for success as an attacker. So if I attack with this armored unit across this wadi, which will affect its combat strength by half, against these units here, as understrength as they may seem, that would still be a relatively equal combat, and thus more likely to produce a bad result as the attacker. So I'm not going to do that, and I'm going to leave this example until we get to exploitation, but I will go give a few other combat examples. For example, let's go up the map here to our ongoing Tunisia starting game, over to here, and let's conduct a combat here. Alright, I'm going to just magically generate. Let's just assume that both sides have access to combat supply. I'm not going to specifically simulate that, but let's do a combat here, and let's follow again, right? I'm just going to start giving various examples of combat results, right? So in this case, but we've identified the attacking and defending hexes, we've expended the supply, action rating values. So in this case, the attacker needs to choose, and the attacker is going to choose the 5 action rating first commando. The defender doesn't really have a choice, he only has 1 unit, so the 5 action rating Witzig is it. Alright. Defenders announce terrain choices. So as the defender, I might be in open terrain here, and yeah, there's a point of interest, but that basically has the same, that's just flat stats of ×1 and open terrain. But I'm going to use the hex side of the river in this case as the Witzig, right? And so what the river does is it halves the combat strength right? A minor river halves the combat strength of all attackers, right? So whatever number the attacker can produce, it's going to be halved. So let's determine the initial odds. Just watch the process, right? Watch the process. The attacker is 2 plus 2 plus 6 plus 6, 16. Divide that by 2 because they're attacking over a river. They got a combat strength of 8, right? So now we divide both by the smaller of them. The smaller of them being the defender's combat strength of 5. 8 divided by 5 is 1.6. 5 divided by 5 is 1, so it's 1.6 to 1. What does 1.6 round to per the rounding rule? 1.6 rounds to 2. So this is going to be 2 to 1 in open terrain. Not the worst odds, not the best odds. Relatively bad. Right? So what is the next step? Roll 2 dice. Well, we've determined the DRM. It's equal because it's a 5 attacking a 5 action rating. Right? We're going to roll for surprise. Ooh, okay, this is combat with an equal DRM. What does that mean? A 6. Regular attack, it has to be 5 or less for defender surprise. So in this case, it's a regular combat, nobody gets surprise. What is the next step? Right? Roll 2 dice and use the DRM to determine the results. So where were we? We were at 2 to 1 in open terrain. Let's roll 2 dice. It's 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. AO1, DL1, O1. So what do I want to do here? It's an interesting result, right? I could take the O1. So what I do here is actually quite interesting, right? Remember that a retreat as the attacker has to be all of the units involved in the attack. So if I take an O1, everyone has to step back, right? Now, I can read this result and I can see here that there is a defender L1. So he's going to die either way, right? But should I retreat? And then he dies, and then I'm unable to occupy the gap in the line that I've created? Good question. This is actually a question that's better answered with things like exploitation if you have units in reserve prepared to enter after these attacks. But if you don't, and you want to occupy that position and get across the river before the enemy can reinforce it in his turn, then the only choice would be to right-click, send this guy to the dead pile, kill him, so that you don't have to retreat. The enemy has an L101, so he has to die, and he doesn't have to take his option because he has no units to take the option with, and then you can advance. Killing and retreating and advancing are all of the nuanced decisions that you're going to have to make when you get presented with a combat result based on your dice rolls. And so it's really a matter of what your tactical objective is, what your strategic objective is, that should influence what decision you want to make in that context. So let's just generate some combats and have a look at various different types of combat. Let's line up some Soviet units and some German units, right? So, and then we can also show step losses and what that translates into, right? So we can put him there, and we can take another tank division there, and what else? We can put another one there, keep it interesting. We put one there. Why don't we put what else? Goodness, I'm not sure. Put something there. There. What other combat situations are we hoping to take a look at here? But I think from here we can already sort of outline some various combat results. But let's get some artillery in there too, right? Because we also want to be showing you some examples of what happens with the artillery, right? In this case, the Russians really only have the one artillery brigade, right? And let's say that this is a Soviet attack on some German positions. Let's do various different attacks and show what's possible and what's not possible. So again, oh, that's also another good example. Yeah, no problem. All right, let's do that. Let's stack up a few extra units in there. Let's throw in some extra action ratings for the because if we don't have some decent action ratings involved here, we are definitely not going to succeed at having a good example of combat here. But let's start, right? Let's say that this is a hypothetical combat phase, and for the Russians, and that they are going to barrage an attack. So let's start with barrages, right? Again, I'm not going to be actually paying for any of this with supply points. Just assume that supply is being paid. There's no need to show the mechanical breakdown of that each and every time, right? So let's say that this artillery is going to hit this hex, right? It's 26, which means we go to the 4.3 charts, 25 to 40, it would cost 4T, we pay it, and we take a look at the shifts, right? Now before we were getting a shift to the left for 1 regimental equivalent or less, but in this case we've got a brigade, which is 1 regimental equivalent, and 2 battalions, which is another regimental equivalent. So we've got 2 regimental equivalents total. Greater than 1 but up to 3 is no shifts. There's going to be no shifts there. No hedgehog, no close or very close terrain, no extremely close terrain. There is a correct spotter, there is no strat mode, and we're not dealing with aircraft, so it's just going to be a flat barrage in the 25 to 40, right? Roll 2 dice. A 4 in the 25 to 40 column is a DG, right? So a very close, very high probability of a result under such circumstances, right? Now let's take this artillery and let's have him hit this target, right? Let's see here. So again, most of the same statistics apply. 25 to 40. However, anybody who knows anything about multi-step formations can see that this has 4 steps, 4 regimental equivalents. So you might be thinking to yourself, whoa, greater than 3 regimental equivalents up to 4? Is there a right 1 shift here? No, there isn't. Alright? No multi-step unit or multi-unit formation ever counts for more than 3 regimental equivalents, right? They have that inherent benefit that they cannot be used in and of themselves inherently to increase your density shifts. If they're mixed in with other units, absolutely, but they just, this, even though he has 4 regimental equivalents there, even though he has 4 steps, well, steps aren't part of this, but even though, for all intents and purposes, he is 4 regimental equivalents, for the purpose of density shifts, he cannot be counted for more than 3. I know that sounds confusing, but it's just a way of balancing out the game, right? So there's, for all intents and purposes, there's absolutely no shifts on this, right? Let's roll 2 dice and see what result we get. Cool. So we get a 9, which is a parenthesized half. Now this is not, he's not in a level 3 or 4 hedgehog, right? He is, it's not an air or ship barrage, and there is a correct spotter, so it is a regular half result, which means you roll 1 die, on a 4 to 6 it loses a step and becomes DG, otherwise it's DG only. So, cool, we roll a 2, which means he doesn't lose a step, but he does become DG, right? For the sake of argument, let's throw in a hedgehog onto these hexes, onto this guy here. Alright. Just so you can also see what hedgehogs do to combat. Right. Now I'm not going to barrage him. I'm using him for a separate demonstration. Let's enter the combat phase and let's display some more combat. Right. So let's have these 2 units attack this stack of units here. Alright. Cool. So let's just assume that it's paid for, and let's go through the procedure. So we've selected the attacking and defending hexes. We've paid the supply. Right, action rating values. As the attacker, I'm going to announce this 4 action rating Para Brigade as the action rating unit, and as the defender, I'm going to use this Pioneer Battalion as the Germans, right? The Germans don't have a choice in terrain, it's really just open terrain, and we're going to determine the initial odds, right? Now, this Para unit has no AT, there's no times modifier for it, it's other, right? Let's take a look at the terrain effects chart for Smolensk, right? Open terrain, other is ×1. Now, this is mechanized for the purposes of special modifiers, but for the purposes of AT, it's heavy AT, which is that confusing thing that we talked about before, right? But it's 2 times unless it encounters heavy AT. Now, there's heavy AT in this hex in multiple places. Hedgehogs have heavy AT, right? As do this unit, which is an AT unit, right? Now, before we go any further, let's take this as an opportunity to actually read about hedgehogs as a unit, right? And we can find that by going down to specialized units and briefly checking out hedgehogs. Where are you? Oh, never mind, they have their own category. Cool. So let's quickly read here. Hedgehogs, called hogs, represent fieldworks, wire, mines, and other obstacles that help protect a hex from combat and barrage attacks. Hedgehogs cannot move and never require supply. Hedgehogs are non-combat units, so enemy units can only enter these hexes if they are attack capable. Regarding the hedgehog, see 9.14e regarding their capture. Hedgehogs come in 4 levels of increasing quality. No hedgehogs can be built beyond level 4. Now, regarding their construction, I'm going to leave that till we start looking at engineer capable units, which is not in this video. Same with reduction. Let's just focus on their combat effects. A hedgehog aids defensive combat with a die roll modifier equal to its level, so a level 3 hedgehog gives you a -3 DRM. A defender's hedgehog also gives you a surprise of -1 DRM, and that doesn't change per level, so we'll look into that in a second, right? Now, AT effects. Hedgehogs provide heavy AT to combat units in the hex, right? Another thing to keep in mind. Reserve mode units cannot end their phase in a hedgehog. Another important thing to keep in mind. Although controversial, yeah, it's the rule. You cannot have reserve mode units in a hedgehog. There can never be any more than 1 hedgehog in a hex. Pretty common sense stuff, right? Combat and barrage results never reduce or eliminate a hedgehog, right? Although there are special rules sometimes that reduce them. So, for the purposes of what we're doing right here, which is combat, essentially, what this hedgehog is going to do is it's going to provide a DRM and heavy AT. That's the primary purpose of it within the context of the combat that we are doing, right? So for starters, the 2 times that this unit would otherwise enjoy is definitely going to be 1.5 times, and that's just going to be +5. So let's do the math on calculating that combat strength. 20 times 1.5 plus 5. So we have an enemy attacking combat strength of 35. Now the defenders are going to be halved for the DG, so it's 10 plus 2 plus 2, so that's 14 divided by 2. Now we know that's 7. So we can divide 35 by 7 to get 5, and 7 divided by 7 is 1. So we've got 5 to 1 in open terrain. Alright, let's go take a look at where that puts us in the initial columns. Right, that puts us right here, 5 to 1. We've got 5 to 1 in open terrain. Right. Now remember that for the purposes, we're going to do a surprise roll now. That's the next step. Now, for the attackers, this is pretty simple. I've got a 4 AR, right? Now, for the defenders, they've got a DG that minuses 1 to everyone's AR, but they've got a level 1 hedgehog that pluses 1 to everyone's AR. So for the purposes of AR modification, this DG and this level 1 hedgehog cancel each other out. So, as the defender, I'm using the Pioneers as my AR unit, and they're going to retain their 5 action rating unit because the modifiers cancel each other out in this particular circumstance, right? So as the attacker, I've got a -1 DRM against me. I'm going to roll for surprise. It's an 8, minus 1 is a 7. Nobody gets surprise. So we're going to stay in 5 to 1 in open terrain. And again, the DRM, now bear in mind, like we said before, it's a bit different between surprise and combat calculation. It doesn't matter what level this hedgehog is, right? When it comes to surprise, it's only going to add -1. You know, a level 4 hedgehog is not going to -4 from a surprise roll, but it will -4 from a combat roll. But in this case, it's a level 1 hedgehog, right? So the DG and the hedgehog again canceling each other out. The DRM remains -1 for the combat. We're going to roll. It's a 4, minus 1 is 3. A roll of 3 is AL1 DO1, right? As we can see here. Let's execute the result. Defender first. This bad boy goes to the dead pile. And now the defenders have to decide what they're going to do with their option. Do they want to retreat, which doesn't seem like the smartest choice here, or are they going to kill their unit? So I think they're going to kill their unit, and that is a result of that combat. Right? Let's see what happens here. And I think in this combat I'm going to be able to show you what happens when you begin to inflict some step losses. So we're going to do a combat again with basically a very similar set of units in different circumstances. So this infantry division does not have heavy or light AT, right? So again, let's go through the procedure here. The combat procedure. Alright, we've selected the hexes. We're going to assume supplies paid. Action rating values 4, and this is a 4 modified to a 3. Remember, there's no hedgehog here. Right, and we're going to determine the initial odds. Right, terrain choices are open. There's no choice here. Right, we're going to determine the initial odds. Right. So in this case, because it's open terrain and there's no AT, this 20 will become 40 and 5. So 45 divided by this 20 becomes 10. Right, 45 divided by 10 is 4.5. That rounds up to 5. Right, so we're going to be once again back into 5-1 in open terrain. This time we're going to have a +1 DRM. Let's see if that gives us a better surprise roll. Remember, it's regular attack, so we're going to roll 2 dice for surprise. 7 + 1 is 8 again, so there's no surprise there, unfortunately. We're just going to remain in 5-1, and we're going to roll 2 dice and add the DRM. So it's 3 + 1 is 4, so that becomes again an AL1DO1. So in this case, the very valuable 4 action rating Soviet unit has to die, and the German player has an option, but he doesn't want to retreat, so this time he's going to take his option as a loss. But because this is a multi-step formation, he can take his loss as a step loss. Right? And we talked about this. And we talked about, so a unit with 4 steps can take 4 step losses and then it dies. Right? And we'll use these markers to indicate underneath the unit how many step losses that the unit has taken. Right? So I wanted to use this as an example. Right? And I'm going to go up here to give a bit more of an in-depth explanation of step losses. Right? But, well, yeah, we do need to spend a bit of time covering a bit more options and retreats, but I just want to get a little bit here into step losses. So here I have 3 multi-step formations, the kinds of which that you might see in Smolensk, for example. This one has 2 step losses. So this one has 2 regimental equivalent strength of 2. This one 3, this one 4. So this one can have up to 1 step loss before it dies. This unit can have up to 2 step losses before it dies. This unit can have up to 3 step losses before it dies. I hope that makes sense, right? And remember that the amount of step losses that it takes will govern its strength, its attacking strength, and its defending strength, right? Now you can rebuild these, you can repair these step losses. That's a topic for a different video. Also, you can create these step losses by breaking off breakdown regiments from these divisions. Again, that is a separate video. For now, I'm just explaining that multi-step formations can take losses in the form of step losses up into the ability that they can absorb them. Remember that if any of these divisions here were to take a step loss greater than these numbers, they will die. And they will go to the dead pile. And that's fundamentally what a step loss is. Alright? So, I hope that I've been able to cover all of these topics in sufficient depth, although I really can't show you every situation in every possible scenario in this video, so please experiment with different combats for yourself. The last thing I want to show you in this video is exploitation, and I want to go back to our play example here at the bottom of the Tunisia board to show you what exploitation is. Alright? And for the sake of argument, probably need to generate a unit with a successful exploit result. So for the sake of argument, we're going to say that this combat went a little differently. We're going to put him in the dead pile. And we're going to say that he did succeed and that he did get exploitation. Right? Again, it's a tutorial. I can't always naturally generate the results that I want, but I'm doing this so I can show you what exploitation is fundamentally. So let's say that this is the situation that has come about. Right? A brief explanation of how he gets those exploit results. I will get into that now. So let's talk about exploitation, and let's start by doing the manual reading. Right? First things first, we're going to go to chapter 11, exploitation phase. Right? Because again, if you look at your now that we're done with combat, exploitation is what comes next in the turn. Right? So exploitation phase. During this phase, units can exploit a breakthrough or finish off a battered defensive position. The only ground units that can move or fight are exploitation mode units or units released from reserve mode. Alright? The phase consists of a movement segment, a barrage segment, and a combat segment. The phasing player can release any reserves during this phase. He is not required to do so and can wait to see how things are proceeding in the phase before releasing additional reserves. To keep things straight, players can mark release reserves with exploit markers. Units actually in exploitation mode move at half of their movement allowance, and released reserves move at their full movement allowance. Handle combat, regular, overrun, and barrage in the exploitation phase normally, and the phasing player's ships and aircraft are also eligible to be used in this phase. Right? So that's just the simple explanation of what exploitation is. Let's briefly look here at the exploitation result, because that's what we didn't read in the combat section. Right? Combat results can include an E notation and a number, meaning the attacking unit with an AR of that number or higher might change to exploit mode. Units must have actually been involved in the attack, so only attack-capable units can ever gain an exploit marker. Exploit-marked units can move and fight in the upcoming exploitation phase. Ignore an exploit result if the attacking units are in DG mode. This guy was not. It's an overrun. This attack was not an overrun. And any two adjacent stacks are not mutually adjacent. Thus, in order to gain an exploit result, at most two stacks must be attacking and they must be adjacent hexes. Again, I don't have a direct demonstration of this right now, but just keep in mind that you won't be able to get an exploit result if you're attacking with more than two adjacent stacks. Right? You may need to read over that a few times for it to really come in strong. But the only thing I've really done here is I've just assumed a different combat result. Right? So as opposed to being like an AO1, AL1, or AO1, DL1, whatever it may be, right? We'll assume that it was a high roll, like here, right? And it was like an AE3, DL2, OTGG. See the E here? That's the only thing that we really, besides this DG result, which is the only other thing that hasn't been covered. This is the only thing that we haven't really gotten into yet, and that's E, an exploitation result. So what it, like we just read, what it basically means is that if you score this result, that action rating or higher, so that being 3 or 4 or 2, right, whatever the result you get, gains an exploit marker, so long as it's not invalidated by those rules that we read before, right? The only other thing, and the only other result on this table is DG, and it's pretty self-explanatory. If you get a DG result, the units become immediately DG, and that's it, right? So, looking at exploit, we're going to enter now. We're going to say that the combat phase for this turn is over, for this particular ally turn is over, and they're entering exploitation, right? And let's just do some exploitation moves. Let's take a look at the thing here. So as you can see, exploitation is a phase with 3 segments. Those segments are movement, barrage, and combat, right? So as I like to call it, it's like a turn within a turn. So with pre-selected units and units that succeed very well in combat, you can essentially execute another turn if you prepare well enough, right? So movement is done with exploitation marked units or released reserves, Exploitation marked units can move at half, reserves move at full, right? So let's just assume that this first armored unit remains fueled, but if he was not already fueled, he'd have to be fueled again. He now has 3 movement allowance, right? What do I want to do with that? Well, maybe I would like to cut off this enemy unit. So maybe I will go 1, 2, 3. Right? And I've now formed a barrier along the easiest route for the Germans to take, right? And that's it. 3 movement allowance is all I had, because again, exploitation marked units only have half of their movement allowance, right? But now I can also release these guys from reserve, who were fueled earlier in the video, if you saw that, right? And they too can execute exploitation operations, right? Which I think I will do. So we're going to take these guys, alright, and we're going to go 1, 2, 3, 3.5, 4. Alright, taking advantage of the fact that GAFSA was already secured. Alright, we've released them and we've taken this territory next to these enemy units. And we'll take the artillery and we'll put it in GAFSA, right? Now let's execute the rest of this exploitation phase, right? We're going to say that for now that's it for our movement in the exploitation. Now we'll do barrage, right? Let's use this 6 strength, 6 barrage strength movement mode artillery, right? To barrage this hex. We may or may not be successful. How much will it cost, right? 6 is 2T, so we pay that. Right, in the 5 to 7 column, I don't even really need to look too specifically through the density shifts here to see that there will be no specific shifts. Alright, it's open terrain, it's more than a regimental equivalent, so we're just going to roll 2 dice and hope for the best. A 6 is nope, no success in the barrage, unfortunately. But now we will go ahead and we will conduct combat. Again, in exploitation you can conduct combat with released, reserved, or exploitation marked units. So with these friendly fellows here, we will attack these German units. It'll cost us 3T, and the Axis will pay for their defense. And we'll just magically assume that there was 2T available to pay for that. Again, for demonstration purposes only. And let us now go through our last combat example for this video, and also our example of exploitation, so we can finally wrap up. So here, let's go through the procedure one more time. Right, that procedure is up here, isn't it? Yep. So we've identified the attacking and defending hexes, we've paid for the supply. Action rating values. As the Brits, I'm going to use this 4 action rating Derbyshire Yeomanry, right? The armoured car unit. And the Germans are going to use this artillery unit because it has a 3 action rating, right? Terrain choices, there isn't really one, it's just open terrain for the Germans, right? And then we determine the initial odds, right? So it is open terrain, so this this mechanized unit is eligible for a times modifier. However, the artillery is also red coded, so the 2 times will become 1.5 times. So 2 times 1.5 is 3, plus 1, 4, plus 3, 7, right? So we've got an allied combat strength of 7 in open terrain, and we have an Axis combat strength. Remember that artillery is always just 1, parenthesized 1, and we've got a 1 because this March Battalion is DG. Remember, this DG only affects this unit, right? The artillery never received a DG result, it is not DG, right? So we've got 7 divided by 2, which is 3.5, and obviously 2 divided by 2 is 1, so it's 3.5 to 1. 3.5 rounds up to 4. Is there a 4 to 1 in open terrain? Yes. Alright. I just want to make a brief note because I clearly haven't had a chance to make this note anywhere else in the video. Please keep in mind that the rule is equal to or less than your rounded odds, right? You need to keep this in mind for any future attacks. Do not round columns. So for example, if you get a 7.6, right? If you get a 7.6, hell, if you get an 8.4 to 1, let's just say here in open terrain, you got an 8.4 to 1. A lot of people would think, well, that's 9 to 1 because 8.4 rounds to 8, and 8, there isn't an 8 here, so just round to the highest column. No. Right? You round to the next full number. If it's an 8.4, that means rounding to 8. And the rule says equal to or less than. Pick a column that is equal to or less than, so it becomes 7 to 1. I haven't had an opportunity in this tutorial video to give you a concrete example of that, but just keep it in mind. But in this case, we're at 4 to 1. 3 to 5 rounds to 4 to 1 in open terrain with a DRM of +1 in my favor, right? So let's roll for surprise. It's a regular attack. It could have been an overrun, but I'm deciding to do a regular attack. Why? I don't know. No tactical reasoning, right? Roll for surprise. 9 + 1 is 10, so surprise is scored. 3 shifts. 4 to 1 becomes 1, 2, 3. 9 to 1 in open terrain, right? We're going to roll for our combat and +1. 8 + 1 is 9. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Now that's an AE4, DL102. Now keep in mind, exploitation results cannot be earned in either overrun or exploitation. This should be pretty common sense as to why you can't get exploitation in your exploitation phase. But anyway, right? Ignore this exploitation for a result. But it is a DL102. So the action rating unit has to be killed, and it's an O2, which means this unit has to retreat 2 hexes. 1, 2. And the attackers occupy the hex. Right? And that is an example of an exploitation tactical move, right? Moving, barraging, combating, etc. Right? And as you can see, the board looks a little different to how it did when we started the video. So yeah, that is the basics of combat, overrun, reserve, exploitation. There's a little bit in there about hedgehogs, but we'll give it its own video later. So with that being said, I think you are now free to go and experiment on your own board, whether that be a physical board or vassal. Go experiment, follow the combat procedure, experiment, see what kind of results you get. Remember to be most careful when dealing with terrain. Read the terrain rules over and over again because they are the ones that are easiest to forget and easiest to make mistakes with. Thank you for joining me, and I hope to see you on the next one.